Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Special Agent Calder Boone received the call at 2:17 a.m. on a humid August night in 2024. The kind of suffocating Texas heat that made even sleeping feel like work. After 12 years with the Bureau's Organized Crime Division, he had learned to recognize the tone in a supervisor's voice that meant a case was about to consume his life. What he didn't expect was how the voice on the other end would lead him into a conspiracy that reached far deeper into the machinery of government than he ever imagined possible. Boone, this is Langston Dyer. I need you at the Baytown Chemical Facility within the hour. We have a situation that requires immediate federal response. Dyer's voice carried the clipped precision of someone who had spent 20 years navigating the political minefields of federal law enforcement. But there was something else underneath, something that sounded almost like fear. Calder sat up in bed, already reaching for the clothes he had laid out the night before, a habit from his days in the Marine Corps that he had never broken. What kind of situation are we talking about, sir? Baytown PD already has hazmat and fire response teams if it's an industrial accident. There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough that Calder wondered if the connection had dropped. Then Dyer spoke again, his voice lower, more careful. This isn't about the fire, Boone. It's about what caused it. I'm sending you coordinates for a staging area 3 miles from the facility. Come alone, and Boone, don't discuss this with anyone until we've had a chance to brief you in person. The line went dead before Calder could ask any follow-up questions. He stared at his phone for a moment, processing the unusual nature of the call. In 12 years with the Bureau, he had never been instructed to arrive at a crime scene alone, and he had certainly never heard Langston Dyer sound uncertain about anything. The man was a legend in the Houston field office, known for his ability to navigate complex investigations involving cartel operations, white-collar crime, and public corruption without ever losing his composure or his clarity of purpose. 45 minutes later, Calder pulled his Bureau-issued sedan into a dirt clearing off Highway 146, about 3 miles south of the Baytown Petrochemical Complex. The night sky to the north glowed orange with reflected fire, and even from this distance he could smell the acrid chemical smoke that hung over the industrial district like a toxic fog. 2 other vehicles were already parked in the clearing, both unmarked federal cars that Calder recognized from the Houston field office motor pool. Langston Dyer stood near the edge of the clearing, his tall frame silhouetted against the distant glow of the fire. Next to him was someone Calder didn't recognize, a man in his early 30s wearing civilian clothes and an expression that suggested he would rather be anywhere else in the world. As Calder approached, Dyer turned to face him, and in the dim light from the distant flames, Calder could see the strain on his supervisor's face. "Agent Boone, thank you for coming so quickly," Dyer said, his formal tone suggesting that whatever conversation was about to happen was being conducted for the benefit of the third man. "This is Rhett Calloway. He's been working as an informant for us on a matter related to organized criminal activity in the petrochemical industry. Mr. Calloway came to us tonight with information that has significant implications for national security." Calder studied Rhett Calloway more carefully. The man was compact and muscular, with the kind of weathered face that came from years of outdoor work in the Texas sun. His hands were stained with chemicals, and he wore the steel-toed boots and flame-resistant clothing of someone who worked in the refineries and chemical plants that dominated the Baytown industrial landscape. But it was his eyes that caught Calder's attention, They showed the kind of exhausted terror that came from witnessing something that fundamentally changed a person's understanding of how the world worked. "Mr. Calloway, I'm Special Agent Calder Boone. Why don't you tell me what brought you to us tonight?" Calder kept his voice calm and neutral, the tone he had learned to use with witnesses who were on the edge of psychological collapse. Rhett looked at Langston Dyer, as if seeking permission to speak. When Dyer nodded slightly, Rhett turned back to Calder and began talking in a rush, as if he had been holding the words inside for too long and they were finally forcing their way out. "I work at the Sentinel Chemical Facility, the one that's burning right now. I've been there for 8 years, working as a process operator in the Specialty Chemicals Division. 6 months ago, I started noticing irregularities in our production schedules and shipping manifests. Batches of chemicals that were supposed to be sent to legitimate industrial customers were being diverted to unmarked trucks that came in the middle of the night. The quantities were significant. Thousands of gallons of precursor chemicals that could be used to manufacture methamphetamine, fentanyl, or other controlled substances." Calder felt the familiar tightening in his chest that always accompanied the beginning of a major investigation. "Did you report these irregularities to your supervisors?" "I did," Rhett replied, his voice shaking slightly. "I went to my shift supervisor, then to the plant manager, and finally to the corporate safety compliance officer. Every single time, I was told that the shipments were legitimate, that they had been approved at the highest levels of the company, and that I should focus on my job rather than asking questions about things that were above my pay grade." "But you didn't stop asking questions," Calder observed. "No, I didn't, because I started recognizing some of the drivers who were picking up these unmarked shipments. They were known associates of the Galveston County cartel operations, guys who had been arrested multiple times for drug trafficking but somehow always seemed to walk free. And then I noticed something else. The security footage from the loading docks where these shipments were processed was being systematically deleted. Not just erased, but deleted in a way that made it look like the cameras had malfunctioned during those specific time windows." Langston Dyer stepped forward, his expression grave. "Mr. Calloway came to us 3 months ago with this information. We initiated a preliminary investigation and discovered that the diversion of chemicals from the Sentinel facility was part of a much larger operation involving multiple chemical plants across the Gulf Coast. We were building a case, gathering evidence, preparing to make arrests. And then tonight, the Sentinel facility suffered what appears to be a catastrophic industrial accident that destroyed the very sections of the plant where these illegal shipments were being processed. The implications were clear and disturbing. Someone burned the evidence, Calder said. Worse than that, Rhett interjected, his voice rising with barely controlled panic. I was working the night shift when the fire started. I saw how it began. This wasn't an accident, and it wasn't just about destroying evidence. There were people in that section of the plant when the fire started, specifically people who had been asking the same questions I was asking. The emergency exits were locked from the outside, and the fire suppression systems had been manually disabled. Calder felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. You're telling me this was mass murder disguised as an industrial accident? That's exactly what I'm telling you, Rhett replied. I estimate at least 8 people were in that section when the fire started. I tried to help them, but the heat was too intense, and the smoke was too thick. I barely got out myself. He pulled up his sleeve to reveal angry red burns on his forearm. I went straight to the FBI because I knew that if I went to local authorities, I'd end up dead before morning. Langston Dyer's expression was grim in the flickering orange light. Agent Boone, the reason I called you specifically is because of your background in organized crime investigations and your clearance level for sensitive operations. What Mr. Calloway has uncovered goes beyond simple cartel activity. We have reason to believe that the chemical diversion operation involves corrupt officials at multiple levels of government, including local law enforcement, state regulatory agencies, and possibly federal personnel. The statement hung in the air between them like the toxic smoke drifting from the burning facility. Calder had investigated public corruption before, but the scale that Dyer was suggesting was something entirely different. If federal personnel were involved in facilitating cartel access to industrial chemicals, it meant that the investigation would have to be conducted with extreme secrecy and extreme caution. "Sir, what's our mandate on this investigation?" Calder asked, using the formal language that indicated he understood the sensitivity of what they were discussing. "Your mandate is to determine the full scope of the conspiracy, identify all parties involved, and gather sufficient evidence to support prosecution," Dyer replied. "You'll be working independently of the regular bureau structure, reporting directly to me and only to me. You'll have access to specialized resources, but you will not discuss this investigation with anyone outside our immediate chain of command." Calder turned to Rhett Calloway. "Mr. Calloway, you understand that by coming forward with this information, you've placed yourself in significant danger. We'll need to arrange protective custody and potentially relocate you and your family." Rhett shook his head slowly. "I don't have any family, Agent Boone. My parents passed away years ago, and I never married. That's probably why I noticed things that other people were too busy or too scared to pay attention to. I've got nothing to lose except my life, and honestly, after what I saw tonight, I'm not sure that's worth much anymore." The nihilistic resignation in Rhett's voice was deeply concerning, but Calder had worked with enough traumatized witnesses to know that psychological recovery would have to wait until they had established physical safety. "We're going to get you to a secure location tonight. Tomorrow, I'll need you to walk me through everything you know about the chemical diversion operation, the personnel involved, the shipping schedules, the financial arrangements, all of it." "There's something else you need to know," Rhett said quietly. "About 2 weeks ago, I made copies of some documents that I thought might be important. Shipping manifests, internal memos, financial transfers. I hid them in a safe deposit box at a bank in Houston, figuring that if anything happened to me, at least there would be some kind of evidence trail. The key is in my apartment." Langston Dyer's expression sharpened. "Where exactly in your apartment?" "Taped to the underside of a drawer in my bedroom dresser. The safe deposit box is at First National Bank on Westheimer Road, box number 847. Calder exchanged a look with Dyer. If those documents contained evidence of the conspiracy, they needed to be secured immediately. But going to Rhett's apartment could be dangerous if the people behind the fire were already looking for him. "Agent Boone, I think you should retrieve those documents tonight," Dyer said. "I'll arrange for Mr. Calloway to be transported to a federal safe house under protective custody. Once you have the documents, we can begin a thorough analysis of the evidence." As Dyer made arrangements on his phone for Rhett's transportation, Calder studied the burning chemical facility in the distance. The flames were beginning to die down as fire crews brought the blaze under control, but the damage had been done. Whatever evidence might have existed in that section of the plant was now ash and twisted metal. The question was whether the documents that Rhett had hidden would be enough to reconstruct the conspiracy and identify the people responsible. "Agent Boone," Rhett said suddenly, "there's one more thing I need to tell you. About a week before the fire, I noticed that I was being followed, not by cartel associates, but by people who looked like professionals, maybe law enforcement or private security. They were good at surveillance, but not good enough to completely hide from someone who spent 8 years in the Navy before working in the chemical plants. The point is, someone knew I was asking questions, and they've been watching me." The revelation added another layer of danger to an already complex situation. If Rhett had been under surveillance, there was a good chance that whoever was watching him knew he had made contact with the FBI. That meant Calder's own investigation might already be compromised before it had even officially begun. "Did you recognize any of these surveillance operatives?" Calder asked. "One of them," Rhett replied. "I saw him meeting with the plant manager about 3 months ago. Just a brief conversation in the parking lot, but I got a good look at his face. Then I saw the same guy in an unmarked car outside my apartment building a few weeks later. I took a photo on my phone." He pulled out a battered smartphone and scrolled through his photos until he found the image he was looking for. The photo showed a man in his 40s sitting in a dark sedan, his face partially obscured by sunglasses and the angle of the shot. But there was something familiar about his features, something that nagged at the edges of Calder's memory. He had seen this man before, possibly in bureau briefings or at multi-agency task force meetings. "Send that photo to my phone," Calder instructed, giving Rhett his contact information. "I'm going to run it through facial recognition and see if we can identify him." As the photo transferred, a black SUV pulled into the clearing, the vehicle that would transport Rhett to the federal safe house. 2 agents from the Houston field office emerged, both of whom Calder recognized as members of the protective custody unit. They moved with the professional efficiency of people who had conducted countless witness relocations. "Mr. Calloway, these agents will take you to a secure location," Dyer said. "You'll be provided with everything you need, and Agent Boone will meet with you tomorrow to begin the formal debriefing process." Rhett nodded, but as he turned to follow the protective custody agents, he looked back at Calder with an expression of desperate hope mixed with exhausted resignation. "Agent Boone, the people I saw die in that fire tonight, they were good people. They had families, kids, futures. They were killed because they asked the same questions I did. Please make sure their deaths mean something. I will do everything in my power to bring the people responsible to justice," Calder replied, and he meant it. But even as he spoke the words, he felt the weight of a promise that might prove impossible to keep. After the SUV carrying Rhett disappeared into the night, Calder stood alone with Langston Dyer in the clearing, watching the distant flames and processing everything he had just learned. The investigation he was being asked to conduct would require navigating a conspiracy that apparently reached into multiple levels of government and law enforcement. One wrong step could compromise the entire operation or get him killed. "Sir, before I proceed with retrieving those documents, I need to understand something," Calder said carefully. "You mentioned that federal personnel might be involved in this conspiracy. Does that include anyone in the Houston field office?" Dyer's silence was more informative than any verbal answer could have been. After a long moment, he spoke. "Agent Boone, the reason I'm assigning this investigation to you specifically is because I trust you absolutely. Your service record is impeccable. You have no financial vulnerabilities that could be exploited for corruption, and you've demonstrated repeatedly that you value justice over career advancement. But yes, I have reason to believe that someone within the federal law enforcement community is providing protection for the chemical diversion operation." The confirmation of his suspicions sent a chill through Calder's body. "Do you have any specific suspects?" "Nothing concrete enough to act on, but there have been instances over the past year where investigations into cartel chemical supply chains have been inexplicably shut down or redirected. Cases that should have led to major indictments have instead resulted in minor arrests or administrative penalties. Someone with access to high-level intelligence is steering enforcement efforts away from certain targets." Calder understood the implications. If there was a corrupt federal agent protecting the conspiracy, then traditional investigative methods could be compromised. Every database search, every witness interview, every piece of evidence collected could potentially be monitored and reported back to the people he was investigating. "How do you want me to proceed?" he asked. "Carefully," Dyer replied. "Retrieve the documents from Calloway's apartment tonight. Analyze them yourself rather than sending them to the technical analysis unit. Build your case using old-school investigative techniques, physical surveillance, direct witness interviews, financial records that you obtain through personal relationships rather than official channels. Assume that any electronic communication or database query could be monitored by hostile parties. The instruction to conduct a modern federal investigation using analog methods from a previous era was both challenging and necessary. Calder nodded his understanding. What about reporting protocols? If I can't use standard bureau communication channels, how do I keep you informed? We'll establish face-to-face meetings at irregular intervals and varied locations, Dyer said. No phones, no emails, no paper trails that could be intercepted or traced. If you need to reach me urgently, there's a payphone at a gas station on Highway 90 near the Crosby turnoff. Call that number and let it ring 3 times, then hang up. I'll meet you at a predetermined location within 2 hours. The elaborate security protocols confirmed what Calder had already suspected. They were dealing with an adversary who had significant resources and the ability to monitor federal law enforcement activities. The investigation would require the kind of paranoid operational security that was more commonly associated with counterintelligence operations against foreign powers than with domestic criminal investigations. As Calder prepared to leave and retrieve the documents from Rhett's apartment, Dyer placed a hand on his shoulder. Agent Boone, I need you to understand something. The people behind this conspiracy have already demonstrated their willingness to commit mass murder to protect their operation. They've killed at least 8 people tonight, and they won't hesitate to kill you if they discover what you're investigating. Watch your back. Trust no one. And if you find yourself in a situation where you have to choose between gathering evidence and staying alive, choose to stay alive. Dead agents don't bring cases to trial. The warning was both practical and ominous. Calder had faced dangerous situations before during his career with the Bureau and his earlier service in the Marines, but he had never been assigned an investigation where his own organization might be compromised by the people he was supposed to be investigating. I understand, sir. I'll proceed with appropriate caution. As he drove toward Baytown and Rhett Calloway's apartment, Calder couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into something much larger and much darker than a simple cartel chemical diversion scheme. The fire at the Sentinel facility, the systematic deletion of security footage, the locked emergency exits, the surveillance of witnesses, all of it suggested an organization with sophisticated capabilities and insider knowledge of how federal investigations operated. The question that would haunt him for the coming weeks was whether he was hunting a criminal conspiracy or whether he had already become the prey in someone else's carefully constructed trap. Rhett Calloway's apartment was located in a modest complex on the eastern edge of Baytown, the kind of place where refinery workers and chemical plant operators lived in functional anonymity. As Calder approached the building at 3:30 in the morning, he noticed that most of the windows were dark, though a few showed the blue flicker of televisions left on by residents who worked night shifts or couldn't sleep. The parking lot was half full with older model trucks and sedans, vehicles chosen for reliability rather than appearance. Calder had parked 2 blocks away and approached on foot, moving through the shadows with the practiced stealth he had learned during his years in Marine Force reconnaissance. If Rhett had been under surveillance, there was a strong possibility that his apartment was being watched even now, especially after the fire at the Sentinel facility. Anyone monitoring the situation would expect Rhett to either flee or attempt to retrieve important possessions, and they would be waiting for exactly that kind of predictable behavior. The apartment complex was a 2-story structure built in the 1980s, with exterior stairs leading to the second-floor units and a central courtyard that provided the illusion of communal space. Rhett's unit was on the second floor, number 2847, at the far end of the building where it faced the parking lot. Calder studied the approach carefully, looking for any sign of surveillance or ambush. The key Rhett had given him felt heavy in his pocket, a small piece of metal that represented access to evidence that people had already killed to protect. As he climbed the exterior stairs, Calder kept his right hand near his service weapon while his left hand held the key. The hallway on the second floor was poorly lit, with several burned-out bulbs creating pools of shadow that could conceal a waiting threat. He paused at the corner, listening for any sound that might indicate another presence, but the building was silent except for the distant hum of air conditioning units struggling against the Texas heat. Rhett's apartment door showed no sign of forced entry, but Calder noticed something that made his instincts scream a warning. The doorframe had fresh scratches near the lock, the kind of marks that might be left by someone using lockpicks rather than a key. The scratches were subtle, barely visible in the dim hallway light, but they were there. Someone had already been inside the apartment. Calder drew his weapon and held it in a low, ready position as he quietly inserted the key and turned the lock. The door swung open silently, revealing an interior that was completely dark. No lights, no movement, no sound except for the faint ticking of a clock somewhere in the darkness. He waited at the threshold, allowing his eyes to adjust and listening for any indication of another presence inside the apartment. After 30 seconds of complete silence, Calder entered the apartment and moved quickly to the side of the doorway, putting his back against the wall and scanning the visible portions of the living room. The apartment was small and sparsely furnished, the home of someone who spent most of his time at work rather than cultivating a personal life. A worn couch faced a modest television. A small dining table held a laptop computer and a stack of technical manuals, and the kitchenette showed signs of minimal use. But it was what wasn't present that caught Calder's attention. The apartment had been searched, not in the obvious destructive manner of a desperate intruder, but with the methodical precision of professionals looking for specific items. Couch cushions had been carefully replaced, but were slightly misaligned. Cabinet doors in the kitchenette were closed, but not latched. The laptop on the dining table had been moved slightly, leaving a clean outline in the dust that surrounded it. Calder moved through the apartment with his weapon raised, clearing each room with the systematic approach he had learned in the Marines. The bedroom was similarly undisturbed on the surface, but showed the same subtle signs of professional searching. The mattress had been lifted and replaced, the closet had been examined, and the dresser drawers had been opened and carefully searched. The dresser was where Rhett had said he had hidden the key to the safe deposit box, taped to the underside of a drawer in the bedroom. Calder approached it carefully, watching for any signs of a trap or surveillance device. The dresser was a cheap particle board unit, the kind sold at discount furniture stores to people who needed function over form. He pulled out the top drawer slowly, examining it for any indication that it had been tampered with. The underside of the drawer was empty. No key, no tape residue, no indication that anything had ever been attached there. Whoever had searched the apartment had found what Rhett had hidden and taken it with them. The evidence that might have exposed the conspiracy was gone, removed by people who apparently knew exactly what they were looking for and where to find it. Calder felt a surge of frustration mixed with growing concern. The fact that the searchers had known about the hidden key suggested either that Rhett's apartment had been under surveillance with audio monitoring, or that someone had interrogated Rhett about the location of his evidence. But Rhett was supposed to be in protective custody at a federal safe house, which meant that either the safe house location had been compromised or there was a more disturbing possibility that Calder didn't want to consider. He pulled out his phone and called the secure number that Langston Dyer had given him for emergencies. The phone rang 4 times before Dyer answered, his voice alert despite the early hour. "Boone, report." "Sir, I'm at Calloway's apartment. The location has been compromised. Someone conducted a professional search and removed the safe deposit box key. The search was thorough and methodical, suggesting either law enforcement training or private security expertise." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Calder could hear Dyer processing the implications. When did the search occur? Within the past few hours, based on the condition of the apartment. Sir, whoever conducted this search knew exactly what they were looking for and where to find it. That suggests either surveillance of Calloway's conversation with us, or... Calder trailed off, not wanting to voice his concern over an open phone line. Or a compromise of our operational security, Dyer finished grimly. Agent Boone, exit that location immediately and proceed to the alternate meeting point we discussed. Do not return to your residence or the field office. I'll contact you within the hour with further instructions. The line went dead, leaving Calder standing in the ransacked apartment with a growing sense that the investigation was already spiraling beyond his control. If their operational security had been compromised from the beginning, it meant that someone within the federal law enforcement structure had either been monitoring their communications or had been informed about Rhett Calloway's cooperation with the FBI. As Calder prepared to leave the apartment, he noticed something that the professional searchers had apparently missed. Tucked behind the dresser, wedged in the narrow gap between the furniture and the wall, was a small USB drive that had apparently fallen there and been overlooked during the search. It was the kind of cheap promotional drive that companies handed out at trade shows, this one branded with the logo of a petrochemical industry conference. Calder retrieved the drive carefully, holding it by the edges to preserve any potential fingerprints. The drive could be nothing, a random piece of forgotten technology that Rhett had tossed aside and forgotten. But it could also be evidence that the searchers had missed in their focus on finding the safe deposit box key. Either way, it was the only potential lead he had. He pocketed the USB drive and made his way back through the apartment, pausing at the door to listen for any sound in the hallway outside. The building remained silent, but as he stepped out onto the exterior walkway, Calder noticed something that made his blood run cold. Parked in the lot below, in a position that provided a clear view of Rhett's apartment door, was a dark sedan with 2 occupants visible in the front seats. The sedan was unremarkable, the kind of vehicle that could blend into any environment without drawing attention. But the posture of the occupants, the way they sat with the alertness of people conducting surveillance rather than the relaxed manner of visitors or residents, immediately identified them as a threat. Calder couldn't see their faces in the darkness, but he could see that they were watching the apartment building with professional focus. He had 2 options. He could retreat back into the apartment and attempt to exit through a window or back entrance, risking that the surveillance might have additional personnel covering those escape routes. Or he could proceed down the stairs and walk past the sedan, gambling that his identity as a federal agent wasn't yet known to whoever was conducting the surveillance. The decision was made for him when the dome light in the sedan briefly illuminated as the passenger door opened. One of the surveillance was preparing to exit the vehicle, possibly to investigate Rhett's apartment, or to intercept anyone who emerged from it. Calder had perhaps 30 seconds before the situation escalated into a direct confrontation. He moved quickly but calmly down the exterior stairs, keeping his right hand near his weapon while maintaining the casual posture of a resident returning from a late shift. The surveillant who had exited the sedan was now standing near the base of the stairs, partially concealed by a support pillar but clearly positioned to observe anyone descending from the second floor. As Calder reached the bottom of the stairs, he got his first clear look at the surveillant. The man was in his 30s, physically fit with the bearing of someone with military or law enforcement training. He wore dark, casual clothes that allowed him to blend into the nighttime environment, and his right hand was positioned near his waistband in the universal stance of someone carrying a concealed weapon. "Evening," Calder said neutrally, moving past the surveillant with the confidence of someone who had every right to be there. "Hold on a second," the surveillant said, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I need to ask you a few questions. Calder stopped and turned to face the man, keeping his expression neutral while his mind raced through potential responses. The surveillant wasn't displaying any law enforcement credentials, which meant he was either private security or operating in a deniable capacity. Either way, this was a confrontation that could turn violent very quickly. "I don't have time for questions," Calder replied, continuing to walk toward the parking lot. "I'm late for my shift." The surveillant moved to block his path, and now his hand moved more obviously toward his concealed weapon. "I said I need to ask you some questions. You were just in apartment 2847. What were you doing there?" The fact that the surveillant knew the specific apartment number confirmed that this was a targeted operation rather than random security patrol. Calder's options were narrowing rapidly. He could identify himself as a federal agent, which might de-escalate the immediate situation, but would compromise his investigation. Or he could attempt to disengage and escape, which would likely result in a confrontation that could turn deadly. "I don't know what you're talking about," Calder said, preparing himself for violence. "I live in this complex and I don't appreciate being harassed by some random guy in the parking lot." The surveillant's expression hardened, and his hand moved to draw his weapon. But before he could complete the motion, Calder struck with the explosive speed and precision that had been drilled into him during years of close-quarters combat training. His left hand swept up to control the surveillant's gun hand while his right delivered a short, powerful strike to the man's solar plexus that drove the air from his lungs and temporarily paralyzed his diaphragm. The surveillant staggered backward, gasping for air, and Calder followed up with a takedown that put the man face down on the pavement. Within seconds, he had the surveillance weapon secured and the man's hands zip-tied behind his back using restraints from his own pocket. The entire confrontation had taken less than 10 seconds and had been conducted with minimal noise. "Federal agent," Calder said quietly, pressing his knee into the surveillant's back to keep him immobilized. "You're going to answer some questions, and if you cooperate, this doesn't have to get any worse for you." But even as he spoke, Calder heard the sound of the sedan's driver door opening. The second surveillant was exiting the vehicle, and from the way he moved, it was clear that he had witnessed the confrontation and was preparing to intervene. Calder was now facing a tactical situation that was rapidly deteriorating, pinned down with one detained subject, while a second armed individual approached with unknown intentions. The second surveillant moved toward them with his weapon drawn, and in the dim light from the parking lot, Calder could see his face clearly for the first time. It was the same man from the photograph that Rhett had shown him earlier, the individual who had been meeting with the plant manager and conducting surveillance on Rhett's apartment. The recognition was mutual, and Calder saw the moment when the surveillant realized he was facing a federal agent rather than a random civilian. "FBI, drop your weapon and get on the ground," Calder commanded, drawing his own service weapon while maintaining his position controlling the first surveillant. The second surveillant stopped his advance but didn't lower his weapon. Instead, he spoke in a calm, almost conversational tone that was far more disturbing than aggressive threats would have been. "Agent Boone, you're making a significant mistake. The investigation you're conducting has been classified as a matter of national security, and you're currently interfering with an authorized operation." The statement was calculated to create doubt and confusion, suggesting that Calder's own investigation might be the unauthorized activity rather than the surveillance operation he had just disrupted. It was a classic intelligence service tactic, using bureaucratic ambiguity to paralyze law enforcement response. "I'm going to need to see credentials and authorization for this operation," Calder replied, keeping his weapon trained on the second surveillant. "Until you can provide documentation from a supervisory special agent or higher authority, you're conducting unauthorized surveillance in the middle of an active FBI investigation." The surveillance expression didn't change, but Calder noticed his finger move slightly on the trigger of his weapon. The man was calculating whether he could take the shot before Calder could respond, weighing the risk of a firefight against whatever orders he was operating under. "The documentation you're requesting is classified above your clearance level," the surveillance said. "You need to release my partner and step away from this location. The assets we're monitoring are critical to ongoing national security operations." The claim that the surveillance was part of a classified national security operation was possible, but unlikely. Calder had sufficient security clearance to be read into most domestic counterintelligence operations, and Langston Dyer would have known if there was a legitimate reason to stay away from investigating the chemical diversion conspiracy. The more probable explanation was that the surveillance were either working for the conspiracy itself or were a corrupt faction within the intelligence community that was providing protection for the criminal operation. "I'm going to need a name and badge number," Calder insisted, "along with the name of your supervising agent. If this is a legitimate operation, you should have no problem providing that information." The surveillance weapon didn't waver. "This is your last opportunity to disengage, Agent Boone. Walk away now, and we can all pretend this encounter never happened. Continue to interfere, and you'll be creating problems that will end your career and possibly your life." The naked threat confirmed what Calder had already suspected. These weren't legitimate law enforcement or intelligence operatives conducting authorized surveillance. They were assets working for the conspiracy, tasked with monitoring potential threats and eliminating evidence. The question was whether they were willing to kill a federal agent to protect their operation. The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for the appearance of lights in several apartment windows around the courtyard. The confrontation had attracted the attention of residents, and within moments there would be witnesses and potentially 911 calls to local police. The surveillant recognized the changing tactical situation at the same moment Calder did. "This isn't over," the surveillant said, lowering his weapon slightly but not holstering it. "You're investigating things that are far beyond your understanding. People who ask too many questions about the Baytown operation tend to have tragic accidents." With that final threat, the surveillant began backing toward the sedan, keeping his weapon trained on Calder until he reached the vehicle. He paused only long enough to help his partner, whom Calder reluctantly released from the zip-tie restraints, before both men climbed into the sedan and drove out of the parking lot at a speed that suggested urgent departure rather than casual withdrawal. Calder stood in the parking lot, his heart pounding from the adrenaline of the confrontation, processing what had just happened. The surveillance had known his name, which meant they had access to FBI personnel information. They had claimed to be operating under classified national security authorization, which suggested either a genuine intelligence operation or a sophisticated cover story. And they had made explicit threats about what happened to people who investigated the Baytown operation, confirming that the conspiracy was willing to use violence to protect itself. As residents began emerging from their apartments to investigate the commotion, Calder made the decision to evacuate the area before local police arrived and created additional complications. He walked quickly to his vehicle, parked 2 blocks away, and drove toward the alternate meeting location that Langston Dyer had specified during their earlier phone conversation. The meeting point was a 24-hour diner on Highway 90. The kind of anonymous roadside establishment where refinery workers and truck drivers stopped for coffee during night shifts. As Calder pulled into the parking lot 40 minutes later, he saw Dyer's vehicle already parked in a corner space that provided a clear view of the highway and the surrounding area. Dyer was sitting in a booth near the back of the diner, nursing a cup of coffee and studying a map that was spread out on the table in front of him. He looked up as Calder approached, and the expression on his face suggested that he had already received some kind of disturbing news. "Agent Boone, sit down," Dyer said quietly. "We have a significant problem." Calder slid into the booth across from his supervisor and quickly recounted the events at Rhett's apartment, the evidence of professional searching, the discovery of the USB drive, and the confrontation with the surveillance. Dyer listened without interruption, his expression growing progressively grimmer as the report continued. "The surveillance knew your name," Dyer said when Calder finished. "That confirms what I suspected. Our operation has been compromised from the beginning, possibly from the moment Rhett Calloway made contact with the Bureau. Sir, is there any possibility that the surveillance were legitimate intelligence operatives conducting an authorized operation?" Dyer shook his head slowly. "I've spent the past hour making secure calls to every agency that might have jurisdiction over chemical diversion investigations. DEA, ATF, Homeland Security, even the CIA's Domestic Operations Division. None of them have any active operations in Baytown, and none of them have authorized surveillance on Rhett Calloway or his associates." The confirmation that the surveillance were not legitimate federal operatives made the situation even more disturbing. It meant that the conspiracy had access to resources and personnel sophisticated enough to impersonate intelligence agents and conduct professional surveillance operations. "What about Rhett?" Calder asked. "Is he still secure at the safe house?" Dyer's pause before answering told Calder everything he needed to know. The protective custody team reported an incident approximately 1 hour ago. They were transporting Calloway to the safe house when they were intercepted by what appeared to be a law enforcement vehicle. The intercepting unit displayed credentials identifying them as Homeland Security investigations, claimed that Calloway was wanted for questioning in a separate matter, and demanded custody of the witness. "Please tell me your team didn't hand him over." They followed protocol for verifying interagency transfers, Dyer said grimly. The credentials appeared legitimate. The badge numbers checked out in the HSI database, and the transfer orders were signed by a supervisory special agent whose identity we've since confirmed. But when we contacted HSI headquarters to verify the transfer, they had no record of any operation involving Rhett Calloway and no authorization for the agents who claimed custody. Calder felt a chill run through his body. "They took him. We have units searching for the vehicle now, but I'm not optimistic about our chances of finding Calloway alive. Whoever orchestrated his abduction has demonstrated access to law enforcement databases, the ability to forge credentials, and the sophistication to intercept a federal protective custody transport. These are not street-level criminals. This is an organization with significant resources and insider knowledge." The loss of their primary witness was a devastating blow to the investigation, but it also revealed something important about the scope of the conspiracy. The people behind the chemical diversion operation were willing to risk an operation that involved impersonating federal agents and abducting a witness from protective custody. That level of audacity suggested either desperation or complete confidence that they could operate with impunity. "Sir, I recovered something from Calloway's apartment," Calder said, producing the USB drive he had found behind the dresser. "It might be nothing, but it's the only potential evidence we have now that the safe deposit box key has been taken." Dyer examined the drive carefully, holding it up to the diner's fluorescent lighting as if he could divine its contents through visual inspection alone. "We need to analyze this, but we can't use Bureau equipment if our investigation has been compromised. Do you have any resources outside official channels?" Calder thought for a moment before nodding. "I know someone from my Marine Corps days who works in private sector computer forensics. He's trustworthy and completely disconnected from law enforcement circles. I can have him examine the drive without creating any official record." "Do it," Dyer ordered. "But Agent Boone, I need you to understand something. As of this moment, we're operating completely outside normal Bureau protocols. No official case file, no administrative support, No backup from the Houston field office. If this investigation goes wrong, if you end up dead or arrested or accused of misconduct, I may not be able to protect you through official channels." The warning was both sobering and necessary. Calder was being asked to conduct a rogue investigation into a conspiracy that had already demonstrated the ability to compromise federal operations and eliminate threats. He would be working without the institutional support and legal protections that normally shielded federal agents from the consequences of their investigative activities. "I understand the risks, sir, but those people who died in the fire at the Sentinel facility deserve justice, and Rhett Calloway deserves to be found. I'm willing to see this through wherever it leads." Dyer studied him for a long moment, as if evaluating whether Calder truly understood what he was committing to. Finally, he nodded. "Then we proceed, but carefully. Analyze that USB drive, see if it contains anything useful. I'll continue working my contacts to try to locate Calloway and identify the people who abducted him. We'll communicate only through the protocols we established earlier. Trust no one. Assume all electronic communications are monitored, and if you find yourself in a situation where you're outgunned or outnumbered, retreat and regroup rather than becoming another casualty." As they prepared to leave the diner and go their separate ways, Calder had one final question. "Sir, what do you think we're really dealing with here? This goes beyond simple cartel operations or public corruption. The level of sophistication and the willingness to directly confront federal agents suggests something much larger." Langston Dyer was silent for a moment, staring out the diner window at the darkness beyond. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that suggested he had been asking himself the same question. "I think we've stumbled onto something that was never meant to be discovered, Agent Boone. Something that connects criminal organizations with elements of the intelligence community and possibly with people at very high levels of government. The Baytown chemical facility fire wasn't just about destroying evidence. It was a message to anyone who might be asking questions. And now that we've started pulling on this thread, I'm afraid we're going to discover that the conspiracy goes deeper and darker than either of us can currently imagine." The computer forensics specialist that Calder contacted was a former Marine Corps intelligence analyst named Marcus Voss, someone he had served with during 2 deployments to Afghanistan. Voss now ran a small private security consulting firm in Houston that specialized in digital forensics for corporate clients, work that kept him well outside the circles of federal law enforcement, but gave him access to sophisticated analytical tools. More importantly, Voss was someone Calder trusted absolutely, a man who had proven his reliability under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. They met at Voss's office in a nondescript building near the Galleria district at 7 in the morning, early enough that the building's other tenants hadn't yet arrived for their workday. Voss looked much the same as he had during their service together, compact and muscular with the alert eyes of someone who had spent years analyzing threats in hostile environments. He greeted Calder with a firm handshake and led him into a secure laboratory filled with the computer equipment that would have been at home in any federal forensics facility. "Boone, it's been too long," Voss said as he powered up his analysis workstation. "When you called and said you needed off-the-books forensic work, I figured you'd gotten yourself into something complicated. Want to tell me what this is about?" Calder handed him the USB drive and provided a carefully edited version of the investigation. Enough context for Voss to understand the sensitivity of the work, but not so much detail that it would put him at risk. Voss listened without interruption, his expression growing progressively more serious as the explanation continued. "So, you're investigating a conspiracy that involves cartel operations, public corruption, and possibly compromised federal agents," Voss summarized when Calder finished. "And you need me to analyze this drive without creating any digital footprint that could be traced back to you or monitored by hostile parties." that's the situation. Can you help? Voss examined the USB drive carefully, noting the promotional branding from a petrochemical industry conference. I can analyze this using an air-gapped system that's completely isolated from any network connection. Whatever data is on this drive will be examined in a sterile environment with no possibility of remote monitoring or data exfiltration. But Boone, if this drive contains evidence of the conspiracy you're describing, you understand that analyzing it could make me a target as well. I understand, and I wouldn't ask if I had any other options. The Bureau's technical analysis unit has been compromised, and I need someone I can trust absolutely. Voss nodded slowly. Then let's see what we're dealing with. He inserted the USB drive into a specialized computer system that was physically isolated from any network connection, a security measure that would prevent any malware or tracking software on the drive from communicating with external servers. The system booted up with the kind of elaborate security protocols that Calder associated with classified intelligence operations, multiple authentication steps, and encryption layers that would protect the data even if the physical hardware was seized. The USB drive contained a single folder labeled Shipping Documentation, and within that folder were hundreds of PDF files that appeared to be copies of shipping manifests, bills of lading, and customs declarations. At first glance, they looked like routine paperwork for chemical shipments, the kind of documentation that any industrial facility would maintain as part of normal business operations. But as Voss began examining the files more carefully, patterns began to emerge that revealed something far more sinister. These manifests have been altered, Voss observed, pulling up two versions of the same document side by side on his monitors. Look at this. The original manifest lists the destination as a legitimate pharmaceutical manufacturing facility in Ohio, but the altered version shows the same shipment going to a warehouse address in Mexico that doesn't correspond to any registered business. Calder leaned closer to examine the documents. The alterations were subtle, changes to routing codes and destination addresses that would be almost impossible to detect without having access to both the original and modified versions. But the implications were staggering. Someone within the Sentinel chemical facility had been systematically diverting shipments of precursor chemicals away from legitimate industrial customers and redirecting them to cartel-controlled distribution networks. How many of these altered manifests are there? Calder asked. Voss ran a quick analysis program that compared file metadata and document structures. At least 200 shipments over a 6-month period. The quantities involved are significant. We're talking about thousands of gallons of chemicals that could be used to manufacture methamphetamine, fentanyl, and other controlled substances. The street value of the drugs that could be produced from these precursors would be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. The scale of the operation was far larger than Calder had initially suspected. This wasn't a small-scale diversion scheme run by corrupt plant workers. It was an industrial-scale smuggling operation that required coordination at multiple levels of the organization, from the workers who processed the shipments to the managers who approved the altered documentation to the corporate executives who ensured that regulatory oversight was avoided or circumvented. Is there any indication of who was responsible for creating these altered documents? Calder asked. Voss examined the file metadata more carefully, pulling up information about when the documents were created, which computers were used to generate them, and which user accounts had access to the files. The metadata shows that the alterations were made using computers registered to 3 different user accounts within the Sentinel Chemical Facilities Administrative Network. I can give you the names associated with those accounts. He pulled up a spreadsheet that listed the user accounts and their associated employee information. The names included a logistics coordinator, a shipping supervisor, and someone whose job title was listed as Regulatory Compliance Officer. All 3 were positions that would have access to shipping documentation and the authority to make modifications without triggering automated security alerts. "Can you pull up any additional information about these employees?" Calder asked, recognizing that identifying the specific individuals involved in the conspiracy would be crucial to building a prosecutable case. Voss navigated through the files on the USB drive until he found a folder labeled Personnel Records. Inside were what appeared to be employee files that had been copied from the facility's human resources database, including background information, employment histories, and security clearance documentation. The files were incomplete, containing information only on the 3 employees whose user accounts had been used to alter the shipping manifests, but they provided valuable intelligence about the conspiracy's structure. The logistics coordinator was a man named Gerald Stratton, who had worked at the Sentinel facility for 12 years and had previously been employed by several other chemical manufacturing companies across the Gulf Coast. His employment history showed a pattern of moving between facilities every few years, which by itself wasn't unusual in an industry where workers often relocated for better opportunities. But when Voss cross-referenced the timing of Stratton's employment at each facility with public records of chemical diversion investigations, a disturbing pattern emerged. "Look at this," Voss said, pulling up a timeline that showed Stratton's employment history alongside news reports of cartel chemical smuggling operations. Every facility where Stratton worked experienced unexplained chemical losses or shipping irregularities during his tenure. But he was never prosecuted or even publicly identified as a suspect. It's like he's been moving from facility to facility, setting up diversion operations and then moving on before law enforcement could build a case against him. Or he's been protected, Calder observed. Someone with the authority to shut down investigations before they could expose his involvement. The second employee, the shipping supervisor, was a woman named Patricia Hayward, who had a much shorter employment history at the Sentinel facility, only 18 months. But her background included previous work with a private logistics company that had been implicated in cross-border smuggling operations before declaring bankruptcy and dissolving just ahead of federal indictments. Patricia had apparently landed on her feet after that company's collapse, finding employment at Sentinel Chemical despite a background that should have raised red flags during the hiring process. The third employee, the regulatory compliance officer, was perhaps the most disturbing. His name was Thomas Braddock, and his employment file showed that he had previously worked for the Environmental Protection Agency as a chemical safety inspector before transitioning to the private sector. His job at Sentinel Chemical involved ensuring that the facility complied with federal regulations regarding the handling and transportation of hazardous materials, which meant he was ideally positioned to cover up any irregularities in shipping documentation or chemical inventory records. A former EPA inspector working as a compliance officer for a facility that's diverting chemicals to cartel operations, Voss said quietly. That's not a coincidence. That's deliberate infiltration of a critical oversight position. Calder felt the pieces of the conspiracy beginning to come together in his mind. The operation wasn't just about corrupt employees stealing chemicals. It was a sophisticated network that had been carefully constructed to penetrate multiple layers of the chemical industry's regulatory structure. Former government inspectors, logistics professionals with connections to smuggling operations, and experienced chemical facility workers who knew how to manipulate shipping documentation without triggering automated alerts. "Is there any indication of who these people were reporting to?" Calder asked. Someone had to be coordinating this operation and providing protection from law enforcement scrutiny. Voss searched through the remaining files on the USB drive, looking for any communication records or organizational documents that might reveal the conspiracy's leadership structure. What he found was a series of encrypted email messages that had been copied from the 3 employees' work accounts. The encryption was sophisticated, using methods that would normally require specialized software and technical knowledge to implement. "I can break this encryption," Voss said. "But it's going to take some time. The algorithm they're using is military grade, the kind of thing that intelligence agencies use to protect classified communications. Whoever set this up knew what they were doing." "How long?" Calder asked, aware that every hour of delay represented time that Rhett Calloway might not have. "Give me 4 hours, maybe 5. I'll need to run some decryption algorithms and try to brute force the encryption keys. It would be faster if I could use cloud computing resources, but that would create a digital footprint that could be monitored." Calder made the decision quickly. "Do it. I'll wait here while you work." As Voss set up his decryption programs and began the lengthy process of breaking the encryption, Calder found himself pacing the small laboratory, his mind racing through the implications of what they had discovered. The USB drive that Rhett Calloway had hidden in his apartment contained evidence of a conspiracy that involved systematic chemical diversion, regulatory infiltration, and sophisticated operational security. But it also raised disturbing questions about how such an operation could function for months or years without being detected by the multiple federal agencies responsible for monitoring chemical manufacturing and transportation. The answer, Calder was beginning to suspect, was that the conspiracy included people within those very agencies, individuals who were positioned to misdirect investigations, suppress evidence, and protect the operation's key personnel. The surveillance who had confronted him at Rhett's apartment, the fake Homeland Security agents who had abducted Rhett from protective custody, the professional search of the apartment that had recovered the safe deposit box key. All of it suggested an organization with access to law enforcement resources and insider knowledge of how federal investigations operated. His phone vibrated with a text message from Langston Dyer, using the secure communication protocol they had established. The message was brief and ominous. "Vehicle used in Calloway abduction found abandoned near Port of Houston. No sign of witness. Vehicle registered to legitimate HSI motor pool but reported stolen 2 days ago. Someone inside HSI provided access." The confirmation that the conspiracy had assets within Homeland Security investigations added another layer of complexity to the investigation. HSI was one of the primary agencies responsible for investigating cross-border smuggling operations and chemical diversion schemes. If the conspiracy had penetrated that organization, it meant they would have advance warning of any federal investigation and the ability to undermine enforcement efforts from within. Calder typed a brief response acknowledging the message, then deleted the entire conversation from his phone. Even secure communications could potentially be intercepted or recovered through forensic analysis, and he couldn't risk leaving any digital trail that might compromise the investigation or identify Marcus Voss as someone who was assisting him. 3 hours later, Voss called Calder back to the main analysis workstation, where he had successfully decrypted a portion of the email messages from the USB drive. What they revealed was even more disturbing than Calder had anticipated. These emails are communications between the 3 Sentinel Chemical employees and someone using the email address coordinator@securologistics.net, Voss explained, pulling up the decrypted messages on his monitor. The messages use coded language, but the pattern is clear. The coordinator provides shipping instructions. The employees implement those instructions by altering manifests and diverting shipments, and then the coordinator confirms receipt and authorizes payments. Calder read through several of the messages, noting the professional tone and the careful avoidance of explicit references to illegal activity. The language was superficially innocuous, discussing special orders and priority deliveries and alternative routing arrangements. But when cross-referenced with the altered shipping manifests, the meaning was unmistakable. These were instructions for diverting chemicals to cartel-controlled destinations. "Can we trace the coordinator's email address?" Calder asked. "That's where it gets interesting," Voss replied. "The email routing shows that the messages originated from a server located in Houston, specifically from an IP address that's registered to a federal government facility." Calder felt his stomach drop. Which facility? Voss pulled up the registration information for the IP address. According to the records, it's assigned to a Homeland Security Investigations field office in downtown Houston. The coordinator has been sending these instructions from inside a federal law enforcement facility. The revelation confirmed Calder's worst suspicions. The conspiracy wasn't just being protected by corrupt federal agents. It was being actively coordinated by someone operating from within the very agency that was supposed to be investigating chemical diversion operations. The coordinator had access to HSI's secure communications infrastructure, which explained how they had been able to monitor federal investigations and compromise protective custody operations. "Is there any way to identify the specific individual using that email address?" Calder asked, knowing that pinpointing the coordinator's identity was crucial to understanding the full scope of the conspiracy. "The email headers don't include any personally identifying information," Voss said. "But I can tell you that the messages were sent during normal business hours, which suggests the coordinator is someone with regular access to the HSI facility rather than an outside hacker who compromised their network." Calder considered the implications. The coordinator was likely an HSI agent or employee who had gone rogue, someone with sufficient seniority and access to coordinate a chemical diversion operation while simultaneously protecting it from federal scrutiny. The level of operational security required to maintain such a position without being detected suggested either exceptional skill or protection from someone even higher in the organizational hierarchy. "Marcus, I need you to prepare copies of everything on this USB drive," Calder said. "Multiple copies, stored in different locations with instructions for release if something happens to me. This evidence is too important to risk losing." Voss nodded grimly. "Already ahead of you. I'm creating encrypted backups that will be distributed to 3 different secure locations. If you don't check in with me every 72 hours, the backups will be automatically sent to the Justice Department's Inspector General, the House Committee on Oversight, and the Washington Post. The insurance policy wouldn't protect Calder from immediate threats, but it would ensure that the evidence survived even if he didn't." As Voss worked on creating the backup copies, Calder's phone rang with a call from Langston Dyer's secure number. "Boone, we need to meet immediately," Dyer said without preamble. "I've received information about Rhett Calloway's location. It's not good." 20 minutes later, Calder was sitting in Dyer's vehicle in a parking garage near the downtown Houston tunnel system, listening to his supervisor explain what had been discovered. Dyer looked like he hadn't slept in days, his normally crisp appearance replaced by the rumpled exhaustion of someone dealing with a crisis that was spiraling beyond control. "A body was pulled from the Houston ship channel this morning," Dyer said quietly. "Male, early 30s, showing signs of severe trauma consistent with torture and execution. The dental records match Rhett Calloway." Calder felt the news hit him like a physical blow. He had known that Calloway's chances of survival were poor after the abduction, but having it confirmed made the loss real and immediate. Their primary witness, the person who had risked everything to expose the conspiracy, had been murdered by the very people he had tried to bring to justice. "How long had he been in the water?" Calder asked, forcing himself to focus on the investigative details rather than the emotional impact of Calloway's death. "Medical examiner estimates less than 12 hours. He was kept alive for several hours after the abduction, presumably while they interrogated him about what information he had shared with us and where he had hidden additional evidence. The torture was extensive and systematic, the work of professionals who knew how to extract information. The implication was clear. Calloway had been interrogated about the USB drive and the safe deposit box, and he had likely told his captors everything he knew before they killed him. The conspiracy now knew that the FBI had copies of the shipping documentation and employee records, which meant they would be moving to eliminate evidence and neutralize threats to their operation. "Sir, I've analyzed the USB drive that I recovered from Calloway's apartment," Calder said, providing Dyer with a summary of what he and Voss had discovered. "The evidence points to coordination by someone operating from inside the HSI field office in Houston. We're dealing with a conspiracy that has penetrated federal law enforcement at a level that makes traditional investigative approaches extremely dangerous." Dyer listened to the briefing with an expression that suggested he had been expecting exactly this kind of disturbing revelation. When Calder finished, he sat in silence for a long moment before speaking. "Agent Boone, I've spent the past 12 hours making discreet inquiries with contacts I trust in other agencies. What I've learned suggests that the conspiracy you're investigating is part of a much larger pattern. Over the past 3 years, there have been at least 6 other instances where chemical diversion investigations were inexplicably shut down or redirected away from promising leads. In each case, the investigations were being conducted by different agencies, DEA, ATF, HSI, but they all followed the same pattern. Initial evidence of systematic diversion, followed by bureaucratic obstacles, compromised witnesses, and eventually administrative decisions to close the cases due to insufficient evidence. Someone's been running interference across multiple agencies," Calder observed. "More than that. Someone's been coordinating protection for a chemical diversion network that spans the entire Gulf Coast region. The Sentinel Chemical Facility in Baytown is just one node in a much larger operation that probably includes dozens of facilities and hundreds of personnel. And the fire that killed 8 people was a message to anyone who might be thinking about exposing the operation." Calder felt the scope of the conspiracy expanding in his mind, growing from a localized corruption case into something that resembled a shadow organization operating within the federal government itself. "Sir, if this operation is that large and that well protected, how do we proceed? Every investigative step we take could be monitored and countered by someone inside the system." "We go outside the system," Dyer replied. "I've been in contact with someone at the Justice Department's Public Integrity section, someone I've worked with before on sensitive corruption cases. They're prepared to open a parallel investigation using resources that are completely isolated from the normal bureau structure. But they need evidence that can withstand scrutiny and can't be dismissed as the paranoid theories of a couple of rogue agents. The USB drive contains that evidence," Calder said. "Shipping manifests, employee records, encrypted communications from someone inside HSI. It's enough to establish probable cause for a broader investigation. Then we need to get that evidence to justice as quickly as possible before the conspiracy has a chance to neutralize us or destroy the remaining documentation. But Boone, once we hand this over, we're committed to seeing it through to the end. If the investigation fails or gets compromised, we'll both be finished in federal law enforcement." Calder understood the stakes. By going outside the normal FBI chain of command and providing evidence to the Justice Department's internal corruption investigators, they were effectively accusing their own organization of being penetrated by a criminal conspiracy. If they were wrong, or if the investigation was shut down for political reasons, their careers would be destroyed and they might face criminal charges for unauthorized disclosure of sensitive information. "I'm willing to take that risk," Calder said. "Rhett Calloway died trying to expose this conspiracy. Those 8 people who were burned alive at the Sentinel facility died asking the same questions he was asking. If we don't see this through, their deaths will have been meaningless." Dyer nodded slowly, as if confirming a decision he had already made. "Then we proceed," I'll arrange a secure meeting with the Justice Department contact. You'll need to bring the USB drive and be prepared to provide a full briefing on everything you've discovered. And Boone, from this point forward, we have to assume that we're both targets. The conspiracy has already demonstrated their willingness to kill federal witnesses and corrupt protective custody operations. They won't hesitate to eliminate federal agents who threaten their operation. As Calder prepared to leave the parking garage and return to Marcus Voss's office to retrieve the USB drive, Dyer added one final warning. Agent Boone, there's something else you need to know about the body they pulled from the ship channel this morning. According to the medical examiner, Rhett Calloway was tortured using methods that are consistent with enhanced interrogation techniques developed by intelligence agencies. Whoever killed him had professional training in extracting information from resistant subjects. That suggests either current or former intelligence personnel are involved in this conspiracy. The implication sent a chill through Calder's body. If the conspiracy included former intelligence operatives with training in torture and interrogation, it meant they were dealing with an organization that had capabilities far beyond those of typical criminal enterprises. These weren't cartel enforcers or corrupt cops. They were professionals who had been trained by the government to conduct covert operations and eliminate threats with maximum efficiency. As he drove back through Houston's morning traffic toward Marcus Voss's office, Calder found himself wondering how deep the conspiracy really went, and whether the evidence on a single USB drive would be enough to bring down an organization that had apparently penetrated multiple federal agencies and had access to intelligence community resources. The answer, he suspected, would determine not just the success of his investigation, but quite possibly whether he would survive long enough to see justice served. The meeting with the Justice Department's Public Integrity Section was arranged for 11 o'clock that night at a location that Langston Dyer described only as secure and completely isolated from federal facilities. Calder spent the intervening hours at Marcus Voss's office, reviewing the decrypted email communications and trying to identify any additional patterns that might reveal the conspiracy's structure or personnel. What he discovered during those hours of analysis would fundamentally change his understanding of what they were really investigating. Voss had managed to decrypt approximately 60% of the email messages from the USB drive, revealing communications that spanned a 6-month period from February through July of 2024. The messages showed a highly organized operation, with multiple layers of coordination and compartmentalization. The 3 Sentinel chemical employees communicated only with the coordinator, who in turn appeared to be receiving instructions from someone identified in the emails only as director. This director never communicates directly with the facility employees, Voss observed, pulling up a network diagram that showed the communication patterns. All instructions flow through the coordinator, who acts as a buffer between the operational level and the strategic leadership. It's classic intelligence tradecraft, designed to protect the leadership from exposure if the operation gets compromised. Calder studied the diagram, noting how the communication structure resembled networks he had seen during counterintelligence briefings about foreign espionage operations. The conspiracy wasn't just using sophisticated encryption and secure communications. They were implementing operational security measures that suggested either intelligence community training or direct copying of classified protocols. "Can we trace any of the director's communications?" Calder asked. "Even if they're not communicating directly with the facility employees, they must be sending instructions to the coordinator." Voss pulled up a different set of email messages, these ones exchanged between the coordinator and an email address that appeared to be registered to a commercial email service based overseas. The director's communications are routed through at least 3 different international proxy servers, making them effectively untraceable without cooperation from foreign internet service providers. But I can tell you that the messages originate from somewhere in the United States, based on the timing patterns and language usage. The emails from the director were brief and cryptic, using coded language that would be meaningless to anyone without context. But when Voss cross-referenced the timing of these messages with the altered shipping manifests from the Sentinel facility, a pattern emerged. The director would send instructions about priority requirements or adjusted specifications, and within 24 hours, the coordinator would issue modified shipping orders that diverted chemicals to cartel-controlled destinations. This is a sophisticated logistics operation, Calder observed. The director is apparently receiving orders from cartel clients about their chemical requirements, then passing those requirements to the coordinator, who arranges for the diversions through corrupted employees at facilities like Sentinel Chemical. But there's something else that's interesting, Voss said, pulling up a spreadsheet that tracked the financial transactions referenced in the emails. The payments for these diverted shipments aren't going to the individual employees at Sentinel Chemical. They're being deposited into accounts that appear to be controlled by shell corporations registered in Delaware and Nevada. The amounts are substantial. We're talking about millions of dollars being moved through these corporate entities. Calder felt the investigation expanding once again. The conspiracy wasn't just about individual corruption or even organized criminal activity. It was a business operation with corporate structure, financial infrastructure, and professional management. Somewhere behind the coded emails and encrypted communications was an organization that was treating chemical diversion as a legitimate commercial enterprise, complete with accounting systems and profit distribution. Marcus, can you trace the ownership of these shell corporations? Calder asked, knowing that corporate ownership records might provide the breakthrough they needed to identify the conspiracy's leadership. I can pull the public filing information, Voss replied. But shell corporations are designed to obscure ownership through layers of nominee directors and holding companies. It could take weeks or months to trace the actual beneficial owners, assuming they haven't used additional legal structures to hide their identities. As Voss worked on extracting the corporate ownership data, Calder's phone vibrated with another message from Langston Dyer. Meeting location changed. New coordinates being sent via alternate protocol. Come alone and ensure you're not followed. The sudden change of plans was concerning, suggesting either that Dyer had detected surveillance or that the Justice Department contact had requested additional security measures. Calder acknowledged the message and waited for the new coordinates to arrive through the alternate communication protocol, a process that involved checking a specific online classified advertisement section where Dyer would post coded messages that appeared to be selling vintage car parts. 15 minutes later, Calder found the coded message and decoded the new meeting location. Instead of the original site, Dyer was directing him to an industrial area near the port of Houston, specifically to an abandoned warehouse that had once been used for chemical storage. The choice of location was both strategic and ominous, providing isolation and security, but also placing them in the same area where Rhett Calloway's body had been recovered from the ship channel. Calder left Marcus Voss's office at 10:15, carrying encrypted copies of the USB drive evidence in a secure briefcase that Voss had provided. The briefcase was designed to destroy its contents if opened improperly or if subjected to unauthorized scanning, a security measure that would protect the evidence even if Calder was intercepted before reaching the meeting. As he drove through Houston's nighttime traffic toward the port area, Calder conducted counter-surveillance procedures that he had learned during advanced FBI training, varying his speed and route, making unexpected turns, and watching for vehicles that appeared to be following him. He detected no obvious surveillance, but the professional nature of the conspiracy suggested that if they were watching him, they would be using methods sophisticated enough to avoid detection by standard counter-surveillance techniques. The warehouse where Dyer had arranged the meeting was located in a desolate industrial district where most of the facilities had been abandoned after the 2008 economic collapse. Rusting equipment and decaying buildings created a landscape that looked post-apocalyptic in the dim illumination from distant security lights. Calder parked his vehicle 2 blocks away and approached the warehouse on foot, moving through shadows and keeping his hand near his service weapon. The warehouse door was slightly ajar, opening into darkness that could conceal any number of threats. Calder paused at the entrance, listening for any sound that might indicate whether the building was occupied. After 30 seconds of silence, he entered carefully, using a small tactical flashlight to illuminate the interior. The warehouse was vast and empty, its floor covered with dust and debris from years of abandonment. In the center of the space, a single battery-powered lantern created a pool of light where Langston Dyer stood waiting. But Dyer wasn't alone. Standing next to him was a woman in her 50s wearing a conservative business suit and carrying a leather briefcase that suggested she was the Justice Department contact they were meeting. "Agent Boone, thank you for coming," Dyer said as Calder approached the circle of light. "This is Deputy Assistant Attorney General Sandra Kellerman from the Justice Department's Public Integrity Section. She's agreed to meet with us under unusual circumstances because of the sensitive nature of what we're investigating." Sandra Kellerman extended her hand for a professional handshake, and Calder noted that she had the confident bearing of someone accustomed to operating at high levels of government. Her eyes were sharp and evaluative, suggesting that she was already forming assessments about his credibility and reliability. "Agent Boone, SAC Dyer has briefed me on the general outline of your investigation," Kellerman said. "He tells me you've uncovered evidence of a conspiracy involving chemical diversion, public corruption, and penetration of federal law enforcement agencies. Those are serious allegations that require serious evidence." Calder placed the secure briefcase on the floor and opened it using the access code that Marcus Voss had provided. "Ma'am, the evidence on these drives documents a systematic chemical diversion operation involving the Sentinel Chemical Facility in Baytown and potentially dozens of other facilities across the Gulf Coast. The operation appears to be coordinated by someone operating from inside the Homeland Security Investigations Field Office in Houston, and it involves corrupted employees at multiple levels of the chemical manufacturing and regulatory oversight systems." He spent the next 20 minutes providing a detailed briefing on everything he had discovered: the altered shipping manifests, the encrypted communications with the coordinator, the evidence of torture and execution of witnesses, and the sophisticated operational security that suggested intelligence community involvement. Kellerman listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a small leather journal, but otherwise maintaining an expression of professional neutrality. When Calder finished his briefing, Kellerman was silent for a long moment before speaking. "Agent Boone, what you're describing sounds like a classic counterintelligence operation that's been corrupted for criminal purposes. The communication security, the compartmentalization, the use of shell corporations for financial transactions, these are all techniques that intelligence agencies use for legitimate national security operations. The question is whether we're dealing with rogue intelligence personnel or whether this is somehow a sanctioned operation that's been perverted beyond its original mandate." The suggestion that the conspiracy might have originated as a legitimate government operation sent a chill through Calder's body. "Ma'am, are you suggesting that this chemical diversion network might have federal authorization?" "I'm suggesting that we need to be very careful about assumptions," Kellerman replied. "There are classified programs that involve controlled chemical transactions for various intelligence and diplomatic purposes. It's possible that what you've uncovered is a legitimate operation that's being abused by corrupt participants. Or it's possible that the conspiracy is using the appearance of government authorization to protect itself from scrutiny." Langston Dyer stepped forward, his expression grim. "Deputy Assistant Attorney General, with respect, 8 people were murdered in an industrial fire designed to destroy evidence. A federal witness was tortured and executed after being abducted from protective custody. Whatever this operation's origins might have been, It's clearly operating outside any legitimate legal authority now. Kellerman nodded slowly. I agree, which is why I'm prepared to open a formal investigation with resources from outside the normal FBI structure. But I need you both to understand something. If this conspiracy does have connections to the intelligence community or to classified programs, the investigation could be shut down for national security reasons. People at very high levels of government might decide that exposing this operation would cause more damage than allowing it to continue. The possibility that political considerations might override law enforcement imperatives was disturbing but not surprising. Calder had worked in federal law enforcement long enough to understand that some investigations were considered too sensitive to pursue through normal channels, especially when they touched on intelligence community operations or threatened to expose embarrassing government failures. "What do you need from us to proceed?" Calder asked. "Everything you have," Kellerman replied. "All the evidence from the USB drive, all the witness statements, all the documentation you've compiled. I'll need to brief the Attorney General personally on this matter, and he'll need to decide whether to authorize a full investigation or whether to refer this to the Intelligence Community Inspector General for handling through classified channels." As Calder handed over the encrypted copies of the evidence, a sound echoed through the warehouse that made all three of them freeze. It was the unmistakable sound of vehicles approaching the building, multiple engines moving in coordinated fashion that suggested a planned operation rather than random activity. "We need to leave now," Dyer said urgently, his hand moving to his service weapon. This location was supposed to be secure. But even as they moved toward the warehouse's rear exit, the building was suddenly illuminated by high-intensity lights from outside. Vehicle-mounted searchlights cut through the darkness, creating harsh shadows and eliminating any possibility of concealment. Through the warehouse's broken windows, Calder could see at least 6 vehicles surrounding the building, their occupants moving with the coordinated precision of a tactical team conducting a raid. "Federal agents, remain where you are," a voice called through a megaphone. "This is a lawful law enforcement operation. Do not attempt to flee or resist." Calder exchanged looks with Dyer and Kellerman, trying to assess whether this was a legitimate federal response or something more sinister. The vehicles and tactical gear appeared authentic, but after everything he had learned about the conspiracy's ability to impersonate law enforcement, he couldn't be certain that the people surrounding the warehouse were actually federal agents. "SAC Dyer, Agent Boone, Deputy Assistant Attorney General Kellerman," the voice continued. "This is Special Agent in Charge Trevor Hastings from the Houston FBI Field Office. You're currently involved in an unauthorized investigation that has been designated a threat to national security operations. You need to surrender all evidence and documentation immediately." Langston Dyer's expression darkened with recognition and anger. "Trevor Hastings is the head of the Houston Field Office. If he's here personally, it means someone at very high levels has been informed about our investigation. Or he's part of the conspiracy," Calder observed quietly. Through the warehouse windows they could see armed agents approaching the building from multiple directions. The agents were wearing tactical gear with FBI insignia, and their movements showed the professional training of legitimate federal law enforcement. But their purpose, whether to shut down a legitimate investigation or to protect a criminal conspiracy, remained uncertain. "What do we do?" Calder asked, looking to both Dyer and Kellerman for guidance. Kellerman's expression was grim. "We surrender the evidence and go through official channels. If this is a legitimate national security matter, we'll have the opportunity to make our case through the proper oversight mechanisms. If it's a cover-up, surrendering now at least keeps us alive to fight another day." But Langston Dyer shook his head slowly. "Deputy Assistant Attorney General, with respect, The moment we hand over that evidence, it disappears into classified channels and we never see it again. Rhett Calloway died to expose this conspiracy. Those 8 people burned alive at Sentinel Chemical died asking the same questions we're asking. If we surrender now, their deaths mean nothing. The sound of the warehouse door being forced open echoed through the building. The tactical team was entering, and within moments they would have the 3 investigators surrounded with no possibility of escape or resistance. In that moment of crisis, Sandra Kellerman made a decision that would determine the fate of the investigation and everyone involved in it. She opened her leather briefcase and removed a small device that looked like a modified smartphone. This is a direct, secure communication link to the Attorney General's office. I'm going to call this in right now and get instructions from the highest level of the Justice Department. Whatever happens next, at least there will be a record that we tried to do this by the book. She activated the device and began speaking rapidly, providing a compressed briefing on the investigation and the current situation. Calder couldn't hear the responses from the other end of the connection, but he could see Kellerman's expression shifting from professional confidence to confusion to barely controlled alarm. "I understand, sir," she said finally, and her voice carried the hollow tone of someone who had just received news that fundamentally altered her understanding of reality. She ended the call and looked at Dyer and Calder with an expression that combined sympathy and resignation. "What did they say?" Dyer asked. "The Attorney General says that this investigation touches on classified national security operations that are beyond Justice Department jurisdiction. We're being ordered to surrender all evidence to the FBI tactical team and to submit to debriefing about everyone we've contacted and everything we've discovered. The investigation is being shut down effective immediately, and we're being placed on administrative leave pending security clearance reviews." The words confirmed Calder's worst suspicions. The conspiracy had connections that reached to the highest levels of government, connections powerful enough to shut down a Justice Department investigation with a single phone call. Whatever the chemical diversion operation really was, it had protection from people who could override normal law enforcement protocols and classify entire investigations out of existence. The tactical team entered the warehouse with weapons raised, their voices commanding immediate compliance. "Hands where we can see them. Do not reach for weapons. This is your only warning." Calder, Dyer, and Kellerman raised their hands in surrender, recognizing that resistance would be both futile and fatal. As the tactical agents moved to secure them and confiscate the evidence briefcase, Calder found himself wondering whether Marcus Voss's insurance policy, the encrypted backups programmed to release if Calder failed to check in, would be enough to eventually expose the truth. Special Agent in Charge. Trevor Hastings entered the warehouse after his tactical team had secured the scene. He was a tall man in his late 50s with silver hair and the kind of authoritative presence that came from decades in federal law enforcement. But there was something in his expression that suggested this operation was causing him personal distress, as if he was following orders he found distasteful but couldn't refuse. "SAC Dyer, I'm sorry it came to this," Hastings said quietly. "You're a good agent, and you were doing what you thought was right. But this investigation has been classified for reasons that are above both of our pay grades. The people you're investigating aren't who you think they are, and the operation you've uncovered serves purposes that you don't understand." Langston Dyer's voice was cold with controlled fury. "Trevor, 8 people were murdered. A federal witness was tortured and executed. Whatever purposes this operation serves, they don't justify those crimes." Hastings' expression showed genuine pain. "Those deaths are being investigated through appropriate classified channels. Justice will be served, but it will be served in ways that protect national security interests. I know that's not satisfying, but it's the reality of the world we live in." As the tactical team led them toward the vehicles waiting outside, Calder caught a glimpse of something that would haunt him for the rest of his career. One of the tactical agents had opened the evidence briefcase and was examining its contents. The agent's face was visible in the harsh light from the vehicle-mounted searchlights, and Calder recognized him from the photograph that Rhett Calloway had taken weeks earlier. It was the same man who had been conducting surveillance at Rhett's apartment, the same individual who had confronted Calder in the parking lot. The conspiracy wasn't just protected by people at high levels of government. The conspiracy's personnel were actively embedded within the FBI's own tactical response teams, positioned to intercept evidence and neutralize threats to their operation. The realization hit Calder with devastating clarity. They had never had a chance. From the moment Rhett Calloway had walked into the FBI field office to report the chemical diversions, the conspiracy had been monitoring and manipulating their investigation. The meeting locations that had been compromised, the protective custody transport that had been intercepted, the warehouse that had been secure, all of it had been controlled by people who were always several steps ahead of the investigators. As they were placed in separate vehicles for transport to the FBI field office, Calder caught Langston Dyer's eye and saw the same understanding reflected there. They had stumbled onto something that was too large, too well connected, and too deeply embedded in government institutions to be investigated through normal law enforcement channels. The administrative leave that followed was a professional purgatory that lasted for 3 months. Calder was confined to his apartment under what was technically called voluntary restriction, but functioned as house arrest. His security clearances were suspended, his access to FBI systems was revoked, and he was subjected to weekly debriefing sessions that felt more like interrogations designed to determine how much he knew and who else he might have told. Marcus Voss's insurance policy never activated. 2 days after the warehouse confrontation, Voss's office suffered what was officially described as an electrical fire that destroyed all his computer equipment and backup systems. Voss himself survived, but left Houston shortly afterward, relocating to an undisclosed location and cutting all contact with his former associates. The encrypted backups that were supposed to preserve the evidence apparently went up in smoke, along with everything else. Sandra Kellerman was quietly transferred from the Public Integrity Section to a position in the Justice Department's Civil Division, where she would spend the remainder of her career processing mundane contract disputes far removed from any sensitive investigations. She never spoke publicly about the Baytown investigation, and the official record showed that she had never met with Calder or Dyer in that abandoned warehouse. Langston Dyer took early retirement from the FBI, citing health reasons that everyone understood were a polite fiction, covering his forced departure from the Bureau. He moved to Montana and started a small consulting business, maintaining no contact with his former colleagues and speaking to no one about the investigation that had ended his career. The fire at the Sentinel Chemical Facility was eventually ruled an industrial accident caused by improper maintenance and operator error. The deaths of the 8 workers were classified as accidental fatalities, and their families received generous settlement payments from the company's insurance carriers in exchange for agreeing not to pursue wrongful death litigation. Gerald Stratton, Patricia Hayward, and Thomas Braddock, the 3 employees whose names had appeared in the evidence on the USB drive, all left their positions at Sentinel Chemical and took jobs at other facilities across the country. Rhett Calloway's death was officially attributed to suicide, with the medical examiner's report claiming that the torture injuries had been self-inflicted in a state of mental breakdown. The report was classified, and anyone who questioned its conclusions was told that the classification was necessary to protect the privacy of Calloway's non-existent family members. And Calder Boone, after 3 months of administrative leave and psychological evaluation, was quietly offered a choice. He could accept reassignment to a field office in Alaska, handling cases involving wildlife smuggling and other matters far removed from organized crime or public corruption. Or he could resign from the FBI with a full pension and a letter of recommendation that would make him unemployable in any position requiring security clearance. He chose Alaska. On his last day in Houston, Calder drove past the Sentinel Chemical Facility, which had been rebuilt and was operating normally. Trucks entered and exited the loading docks in steady succession, carrying chemicals to destinations that might or might not match the official shipping documentation. Security guards checked credentials at the gate, and workers in safety gear moved through the facility conducting the routine operations of a legitimate industrial business. But Calder knew what lay beneath that facade of normalcy. Somewhere in the complex network of chemical manufacturing, shipping logistics, and regulatory oversight, the conspiracy continued to operate. The coordinator still sent encrypted instructions from inside a federal law enforcement facility. The director still received orders from cartel clients and arranged for diverted shipments. And somewhere, people with the power to classify investigations and shut down Justice Department inquiries continued to protect an operation that had already claimed at least 9 lives. As Calder drove away from Houston toward his new assignment in Alaska, he carried with him the knowledge that some conspiracies were too large to fight, too well protected to expose, and too deeply embedded to eliminate. The investigation had cost him his career, his sense of purpose, and his faith in the institutions he had sworn to serve. But it had also taught him something that would shape the rest of his life. In the shadows behind the facade of government and law enforcement, there were operations that served purposes he would never understand and answered to authorities he would never meet. Some of those operations might genuinely serve national security interests. Others were criminal enterprises protected by corrupt officials and classified into invisibility. And the most terrifying truth was that there was no way to tell the difference. 3 years later, a small news article appeared on page 14 of the Houston Chronicle. A fire at an industrial facility in Louisiana had killed 6 workers. The official investigation ruled it an accident. Reading the article in his small cabin outside Anchorage, Calder noted the familiar pattern. The facility manufactured specialty chemicals. The victims had all been long-term employees with knowledge of shipping operations. The fire had destroyed the sections of the facility where documentation was stored. He thought about calling someone, maybe a reporter or a congressional investigator or someone at the Justice Department who might still care about murdered workers and covered-up conspiracies. But he already knew what would happen. The calls would go unanswered, the investigations would be classified, and somewhere in Houston or Washington or some anonymous federal building, people would make phone calls that would shut down any inquiry before it could begin. Some truths, he had learned, were too dangerous to expose and too well protected to bring to light. The Baytown Protocol, whatever it really was, continued to operate in the shadows, and Special Agent Calder Boone, exiled to Alaska for asking too many questions, was alive only because he had learned to accept that some conspiracies would never be exposed and some victims would never receive justice. Special Agent Wesley Gage had been tracking the movements of federal informant Delora Finch for 3 days when she disappeared completely from his surveillance grid. After 9 years with the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, Wesley had developed an instinct for when informants were running scared versus when they had been disappeared by the people they were informing against. Delora's vanishing felt like the latter, which was why he found himself standing in the lobby of a condemned office building in downtown Houston at 2 a.m, staring at an elevator shaft that shouldn't exist according to any architectural plans filed with the city. The building was the old Merchants Exchange Tower, a 20-story structure that had been slated for demolition for the past 5 years but remained standing in bureaucratic limbo, while various parties argued about environmental remediation costs and historic preservation requirements. During its operational life, the building had housed banking offices, law firms, and financial services companies. But those legitimate businesses had vacated years ago, leaving behind a concrete shell that attracted only urban explorers and homeless populations seeking shelter from Houston's unforgiving streets. Delora Finch had been providing information to Wesley about a corruption network involving Houston city officials and construction contractors who were manipulating building permits and inspection processes to facilitate money laundering operations. The investigation had been progressing steadily until 3 weeks ago, when Delora had called Wesley's secure number at midnight and delivered a message that changed everything. "Agent Gage, I found something in the old city permit archives that you need to see," Delora had said, her voice tight with the kind of controlled panic that suggested she had discovered something genuinely terrifying. "It's about the tunnel system under downtown Houston. The official maps don't show everything. There are sections that were built but never documented, corridors that lead to places that aren't supposed to exist. And I think the people we've been investigating are using those undocumented spaces for something much worse than money laundering." Wesley had arranged to meet with Delora the following morning at a secure location, but she never appeared. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Her apartment was empty and showed no signs of forced entry, and her vehicle was found abandoned in a parking garage 3 blocks from the Merchants Exchange Tower. Security footage from the garage showed Delora entering the building on foot at 11:47 p.m., but there was no footage of her exiting. That had been 72 hours ago, and despite an intensive search involving local police and FBI resources, there was no trace of where Delora had gone after entering the building. The official search had been scaled back after 48 hours, with supervisors concluding that Delora had likely fled voluntarily after getting cold feet about her cooperation with federal investigators. But Wesley knew Delora well enough to understand that she wouldn't run. If she had discovered something in those permit archives that scared her badly enough to call at midnight, she would have been determined to expose it, not hide from it. Which was why Wesley found himself conducting an unauthorized search of the Merchants Exchange Tower in the middle of the night, operating outside official channels and risking his career on the belief that his informant was in danger rather than in hiding. He had told no one at the Houston field office about his intentions, communicating only with Detective Tobin Merrick from the Houston Police Department's cold case unit, someone Wesley had worked with before and trusted implicitly. Tobin arrived at the building 15 minutes after Wesley, moving through the darkness with the careful precision of someone who had spent 20 years investigating crimes that others had given up on. He was in his early 50s with graying hair and the kind of tired eyes that came from seeing too many cases that ended without resolution or justice. But he had a reputation for persistence that matched Wesley's own, which made him the ideal partner for an off-the-books investigation into a missing informant. "Gage, you sure about this?" Tobin asked, as he approached the lobby where Wesley was studying the mysterious elevator shaft. "That building's been condemned for 5 years. The structural integrity is questionable, and if we get trapped or injured in there, nobody's going to find us until the demolition crew shows up." "I'm sure that Delora Finch didn't disappear voluntarily," Wesley replied. "And I'm sure that whatever she discovered in those permit archives was important enough that someone wanted to make sure she couldn't share it. This building is the last place she was seen, which means the answer to what happened to her is somewhere inside." Tobin studied the elevator shaft that had caught Wesley's attention. According to the building's architectural plans, there should have been 2 elevator shafts serving the Merchants Exchange Tower, both clearly marked and accounted for in the documentation that Wesley had reviewed. But the shaft he was looking at now didn't appear on any official plans. It was located behind what had once been a reception desk in a corner of the lobby that should have been solid wall according to the blueprints. "That elevator shaft isn't on the building plans," Tobin observed, which means either the plans are incomplete or someone added it after the original construction. Wesley had already reached the same conclusion. The shaft was accessible through a door that had been concealed behind decorative paneling that had been torn away over the years by vandals or urban explorers. The elevator car itself was missing, leaving only the shaft descending into darkness that appeared to extend well below the building's documented basement level. "The city permit archives that Delora mentioned," Wesley said, pulling out copies of documents that Delora had provided during their last meeting. She found references to underground construction projects from the 1960s and 1970s that were classified for civil defense purposes. Apparently, during the Cold War, Houston had an extensive network of fallout shelters and emergency government facilities built beneath the downtown area. Most of them were forgotten after the Soviet Union collapsed. "You think this elevator shaft leads to one of those facilities?" Tobin asked. "I think it leads somewhere that people wanted to keep secret, and I think Delora found out about it and decided to investigate on her own instead of waiting for official FBI response." Tobin pulled out a powerful LED flashlight and shone it down the elevator shaft. The beam penetrated perhaps 50 feet before being swallowed by the darkness below. "That shaft goes down a long way, definitely deeper than a normal basement level. We're going to need climbing equipment if we want to descend safely." Wesley had come prepared with a rope system and harnesses from his personal climbing gear, equipment he had acquired during his years pursuing fugitives through difficult terrain. Within 20 minutes, they had secured the rope to structural supports in the lobby and prepared to rappel down the elevator shaft into whatever lay below. As Wesley clipped into the rope system and prepared to descend, Tobin grabbed his arm. "Gage, before we do this, I need you to understand something. I've been a cop for 20 years, and I've learned that when people go to great lengths to hide something, it's usually because exposing it would be dangerous for everyone involved. If we find what Delora found, we might be putting ourselves in the same danger that she's in now." "I know the risks," Wesley replied, "but Delora trusted me to protect her when she agreed to become an informant. If she's down there and still alive, I owe it to her to find her. And if she's dead, I owe it to her to find out why and make sure the people responsible answer for it." The descent into the elevator shaft was slow and methodical, with Wesley rappelling down while Tobin provided belay support from above. The shaft walls were concrete and showed signs of age and neglect, with water damage and structural cracking that suggested the building's foundation was indeed deteriorating. But about 60 feet below the lobby level, Wesley's flashlight revealed something that made him pause in his descent. There was an opening in the shaft wall, a doorway that led into a horizontal corridor extending away from the shaft. The doorway had clearly been designed for access, with a metal platform and safety railing that would allow someone to step from an elevator car into the corridor. But the corridor itself wasn't visible from above, concealed by the angle of the shaft and the darkness that prevented light from penetrating to this depth. "Tobin, I found something," Wesley called up the shaft. "There's a corridor at this level heading east away from the building. I'm going to investigate." "Negative. Wait for me to join you," Tobin responded. "We stick together down there." It took another 15 minutes for both men to reach the platform and prepare to enter the corridor. The space beyond the doorway was pitch black and silent, with air that tasted stale and recycled. Wesley's flashlight revealed a concrete tunnel, approximately 8 feet wide and 7 feet high, stretching away into darkness with no visible end. The walls showed the kind of construction typical of Cold War-era government facilities, poured concrete reinforced with steel and designed to withstand significant structural stress. This tunnel wasn't built for the Merchants Exchange Tower, Tobin observed. This is military or government construction, probably civil defense related, like you said. They began moving through the tunnel, their flashlight beams cutting through darkness that seemed to actively resist illumination. The tunnel ran straight for approximately 200 feet before branching into a T-junction that offered choices of continuing east or turning north or south. There were no signs, no markings, no indication of what lay in any direction. Wesley studied the floor of the tunnel, looking for any evidence of recent passage. The concrete was covered with decades of accumulated dust, but in the beam of his flashlight he could see disturbances in that dust that suggested someone had walked through here recently. The footprints led toward the northern branch of the junction. "Someone's been down here within the past few days," Wesley said, crouching to examine the prints more carefully. The pattern suggests a single person, walking rather than running, moving with purpose rather than wandering randomly. "Could be Delora," Tobin suggested, "or could be whoever she was following." They followed the northern branch, which descended gradually deeper underground while maintaining the same concrete construction and oppressive silence. After approximately 300 feet, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber that appeared to have been designed as some kind of emergency operations center. The space contained the remains of equipment that had been abandoned decades earlier. Metal desks corroded by moisture, filing cabinets with drawers hanging open, and what looked like communication equipment from the 1970s, slowly decomposing in the stagnant air. But it was what had been added to the chamber more recently that caught Wesley's attention. In the center of the space, someone had set up a modern work area with battery-powered lights, a folding table, and several boxes of documents. The setup suggested that someone had been using this abandoned Cold War facility as a secure location for activities that required absolute privacy. Wesley approached the work area carefully, watching for any indication of surveillance or security measures. The documents on the table appeared to be copies of city permit records, zoning maps, and architectural plans for buildings throughout downtown Houston. But these weren't random documents. They had been carefully selected and organized to reveal patterns that wouldn't be obvious from examining any single record. "Tobin, look at this," Wesley said, studying one of the maps that showed the tunnel system beneath downtown Houston. The map was far more detailed than anything Wesley had seen in official city records, showing not just the documented pedestrian tunnels that connected various office buildings, but also a second network of deeper tunnels that appeared to connect government facilities, utility infrastructure, and locations that weren't clearly labeled. This is what Delora found, Wesley realized. A complete map of the undocumented tunnel system, and she was down here trying to figure out what it was being used for. Tobin was examining the boxes of documents more carefully. "Gage, these aren't just random permit records. Someone's been tracking specific construction projects and correlating them with the tunnel system. Look at this." He held up a document that showed permits for a commercial building renovation approved 10 years earlier. Annotations in the margins noted that the renovation included basement expansion that wasn't reflected in the updated architectural plans filed with the city. Wesley found similar documents showing a pattern that was deeply disturbing. Over the past 20 years, numerous downtown buildings had undergone renovations that included basement or sub-basement work. But the final architectural plans filed with the city didn't accurately reflect the extent of that underground construction. Someone had been systematically expanding the hidden tunnel network, connecting it to buildings throughout downtown Houston, and doing so in a way that avoided official documentation or oversight. "This is a massive construction project that's been hidden from public record," Wesley said. "Someone's been building or expanding an underground facility network right beneath one of the largest cities in America, and they've been doing it by manipulating the permit and inspection process, which is exactly the kind of corruption that Delora was investigating," Tobin observed. "But this goes way beyond money laundering. This is infrastructure development on a scale that would require significant funding and coordination. Who has the resources to do something like this without anyone noticing? Before Wesley could answer, they heard a sound that made both men freeze. It was distant but unmistakable. Footsteps echoing through the tunnel system, moving toward their location with the steady rhythm of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Wesley and Tobin immediately extinguished their flashlights and took cover behind the corroded filing cabinets, drawing their weapons and preparing for whatever was approaching. In the absolute darkness, the footsteps grew steadily louder, accompanied now by the beam of a flashlight that preceded whoever was entering the chamber. The figure that emerged into the chamber was difficult to see clearly in the darkness, but Wesley could make out enough detail to recognize that this was someone moving with professional caution, checking corners and scanning for threats before fully entering the space. The person was dressed in dark clothing and wore some kind of tactical vest, suggesting either law enforcement or private security background. The figure approached the work area where Delora's documents were spread out, and in the reflected glow of their flashlight, Wesley finally got a clear look at their face. It was a woman in her late 30s with short dark hair and the kind of alert expression that came from years of operational experience. She appeared to be examining the documents with great interest, occasionally photographing pages with a small digital camera. Wesley made a split-second decision and stepped out from behind the filing cabinet with his weapon and FBI credentials visible. "Federal agent, identify yourself and show me your hands." The woman spun toward him with reflexes that confirmed professional training, her own weapon appearing in her hand with practiced speed. But she didn't fire, instead freezing in a standoff position that suggested she was evaluating whether Wesley represented a legitimate threat or something else. "I'm going to need to see some identification," Wesley said, keeping his weapon trained on the woman while using his peripheral vision to track Tobin, who had moved to a flanking position. The woman slowly lowered her weapon but didn't holster it. "Special Agent Wesley Gage," she said, and her use of his name sent a chill through his body. "You're investigating the disappearance of Delora Finch. I'm here for the same reason." "That doesn't answer my question about who you are," Wesley replied. The woman reached slowly into her vest and produced credentials that identified her as a federal agent, but not FBI. According to the identification, her name was Cora Lansing, and she worked for the Department of Homeland Security's Critical Infrastructure Protection Division. The credentials appeared legitimate, with proper holographic security features and identification numbers that could be verified through federal databases. "Agent Lansing, what's Homeland Security's interest in a missing FBI informant?" Wesley asked, not lowering his weapon. "Same as yours," Lansing replied. "Delora Finch stumbled onto something that has national security implications. My division has been investigating unauthorized construction in critical infrastructure corridors beneath major American cities. Houston has one of the largest undocumented tunnel networks we've identified, and we believe it's being used for purposes that could threaten public safety." Tobin stepped out from his flanking position, his weapon still trained on Lansing. "That's a very convenient story, but it doesn't explain how you knew we'd be here or why you're conducting solo operations in an abandoned tunnel system." Lansing's expression showed a flicker of respect for Tobin's skepticism. "I've been monitoring Delora Finch's investigation for the past month. When she disappeared, I knew she must have found the entrance to the tunnel system. And when I saw that someone had accessed the Merchants Exchange Tower tonight using climbing equipment, I figured it was either you looking for your informant or the people who took her coming back to clean up evidence." The explanation was plausible, but raised as many questions as it answered. If Homeland Security had been monitoring Delora's investigation, why hadn't they contacted Wesley or the FBI? And why was Lansing conducting what appeared to be a solo operation rather than coordinating with other federal agencies? "Agent Lansing, I'm going to need you to contact your supervisory agent and confirm your operational status," Wesley said. Until I can verify your story, I'm treating this as a potentially hostile encounter." But even as he spoke, Wesley noticed something that made the situation more complicated. Behind Lansing, visible in the beam of her dropped flashlight, were wet footprints leading from the tunnel entrance into the chamber. The prints were fresh, still glistening with moisture, and they didn't match the pattern of Lansing's boots. Someone else was in the tunnel system, and they had passed through this chamber very recently. Wesley's attention snapped to the wet footprints, and he saw Cora Lansing follow his gaze to the same evidence. Her expression shifted from defensive caution to active alarm, suggesting that she hadn't been aware of the third party's presence until that moment. The footprints were distinct and fresh, created by someone who had walked through standing water somewhere else in the tunnel system, and then passed through this chamber within the past few minutes. "We're not alone down here," Tobin said quietly, moving to examine the footprints more carefully. "These prints are heading deeper into the tunnel system, away from the elevator shaft we used to access this level." Cora Lansing holstered her weapon in a gesture that was clearly meant to signal cooperation rather than surrender. "Agent Gage, Detective Merrick, I understand your skepticism about my presence here, but right now we have a bigger problem. If someone else is moving through these tunnels, they're either looking for the same information Delora Finch found, or they're looking for us." Wesley kept his weapon drawn but lowered it slightly, recognizing that Lansing's point was valid. "You said you've been investigating this tunnel system. What exactly are we dealing with down here?" Lansing moved to the table where Delora's documents were spread out and pulled out her own set of files from a waterproof case she had been carrying. "What we're dealing with is a clandestine infrastructure project that's been ongoing for at least 20 years, possibly longer. Someone has been systematically expanding the Cold War-era tunnel network beneath Houston, connecting it to key buildings throughout the downtown area, and creating what amounts to a parallel city beneath the surface." She spread out a map that showed the extent of the tunnel network as her division understood it. The map was far more comprehensive than anything in Delora's documents, showing corridors that extended for miles beneath downtown Houston, connecting not just to abandoned government facilities but also to active commercial buildings, transportation infrastructure, and utility systems. "This map shows confirmed tunnel sections that we've identified through various investigative methods," Lansing continued. "Ground-penetrating radar, analysis of utility records, interviews with construction workers who've encountered unexpected underground spaces during renovation projects. But we estimate that what we've documented represents less than half of the actual network. There are sections that we know exist but haven't been able to access or map." Tobin studied the map with the expression of someone trying to process information that challenged his understanding of his own city. "You're telling me there's been massive underground construction happening beneath Houston for 2 decades, and nobody in city government or law enforcement noticed?" "People noticed," Lansing replied. "But every time someone started asking questions, the investigations were shut down. Building inspectors who found irregularities in basement construction were reassigned or fired. City officials who tried to investigate unauthorized permits had their political careers destroyed. And in at least 3 cases that we know of, people who got too close to exposing the tunnel network disappeared." Wesley felt the familiar chill that always accompanied the discovery that a case was far larger and more dangerous than initial evidence suggested. "Agent Lansing, are you telling me that Delora Finch isn't the first person to disappear after investigating this tunnel system?" "She's the first FBI informant," Lansing said. "The previous disappearances involved city employees, construction workers, and one investigative journalist who was working on a story about corruption in the Houston building permit process. All of them vanished without a trace, and all of them had been asking questions about underground construction that didn't match official records." The implications were staggering. Wesley had been investigating what he thought was a straightforward public corruption case involving building permits and construction contracts. But if Lansing was correct, he had actually stumbled onto something that resembled a conspiracy to create hidden infrastructure beneath a major American city. A conspiracy that had been operating for decades and had successfully eliminated anyone who threatened to expose it. "Who's behind this?" Wesley asked. A construction project on this scale would require enormous funding, political protection, and technical expertise. This isn't the work of a few corrupt city officials. Lansing's expression suggested that she had been asking herself the same question for a long time without arriving at a satisfactory answer. "That's what we've been trying to determine. The funding appears to come from a complex network of shell corporations and offshore accounts that we haven't been able to fully trace. The political protection seems to extend to federal as well as local levels, which is why I'm conducting this investigation outside official channels. And the technical expertise suggests involvement by people with backgrounds in military engineering, civil defense planning, or intelligence operations." "You think government agencies are involved," Tobin observed. "I think government resources have been diverted to this project, whether officially or through corruption and theft. The construction techniques, the security measures, the operational security that's prevented exposure for 2 decades, all of it suggests either active government participation or the involvement of people who were trained by government agencies and then went rogue." As Wesley processed this information, he became aware that the wet footprints they had noticed earlier were not the only evidence of recent activity in the chamber. There were marks on the concrete floor that suggested equipment had been dragged through the space, and several of the filing cabinets showed signs of having been recently opened and searched. "Someone's been systematically searching this facility," Wesley observed, "looking for something specific or removing evidence." Cora Lansing examined the filing cabinets more carefully. These cabinets contained records from the original Cold War facility. "When my division first identified this location 6 months ago, they were full of documents related to civil defense planning, emergency government operations, and continuity of government protocols. Someone has been removing those records, probably because they contain information about the original tunnel network that would help expose the modern expansions." The sound of footsteps echoed through the tunnels again, but this time from a different direction. Multiple sets of footsteps, moving with coordinated precision that suggested a team conducting a search or sweep operation. Wesley, Tobin, and Lansing immediately took defensive positions, extinguishing lights and preparing for what was approaching. Through the darkness, Wesley could see flashlight beams sweeping the tunnels, and he could hear voices communicating in the clipped, professional tones of people conducting a tactical operation. The voices were using what sounded like law enforcement terminology, calling out clear signals as they moved through the tunnel system. "Federal agents conducting authorized search operations," a voice called out from the darkness. "Identify yourselves immediately." Wesley exchanged glances with Tobin and Lansing, trying to determine whether this was a legitimate federal response or something more sinister. The claim of authorized search operations was suspicious given that Wesley's own investigation was off the books, and Lansing had explicitly stated she was operating outside official channels. "FBI Special Agent Wesley Gage," he called out, keeping his weapon ready but not visible. "I'm investigating the disappearance of a federal informant. Identify your unit and supervisory agent." The flashlight beams converged on their position, and Wesley could now see that the approaching team consisted of at least 6 individuals in tactical gear with weapons drawn. They moved with professional coordination, covering angles and maintaining fields of fire that would make resistance futile. The lead operator was a tall man with the bearing of someone accustomed to command authority. "Agent Gage, I'm Special Agent Bryce Sutton from the Houston Field Office's Tactical Response Unit," the lead operator said. We received reports of unauthorized personnel accessing a condemned building in downtown Houston. We're here to secure the scene and ensure public safety." The explanation was plausible on the surface, but Wesley's instincts screamed that something was wrong. He hadn't notified anyone at the Houston field office about his investigation into Delora's disappearance, which meant that either Bryce Sutton was conducting his own independent operation, or someone had been monitoring Wesley's activities and had alerted the tactical unit. "Agent Sutton, I wasn't aware that the Tactical Response Unit conducted operations based on reports of trespassing in condemned buildings," Wesley said carefully. "That would normally be handled by local police." Bryce Sutton's expression remained professionally neutral, but Wesley noticed that the other tactical operators were positioning themselves in a way that would allow them to control the chamber and prevent escape if the situation escalated. "Agent Gage, this building has been classified as a potential national security concern due to its connection to Cold War-era government facilities. Any unauthorized access triggers a federal response protocol. The claim that a condemned office building triggered national security protocols was absurd, but it provided Sutton with bureaucratic justification for his presence." Wesley was beginning to suspect that this wasn't a coincidental response to trespassing, but rather a deliberate operation to intercept anyone who discovered the tunnel system. "Agent Sutton, have you been briefed on my investigation into the disappearance of Delora Finch?" Wesley asked, watching for any reaction that might reveal Sutton's true purpose. "I'm aware that you've been looking for a missing informant," Sutton replied. "But Agent Gage, you're currently in an unauthorized location conducting an unauthorized investigation without proper clearances or supervisory approval. I'm going to need you and your companions to surrender your weapons and accompany us to the surface for debriefing." The demand to surrender weapons was the confirmation Wesley needed that this wasn't a legitimate security response. Federal agents conducting authorized operations would secure a scene and verify credentials, but they wouldn't disarm fellow agents unless they suspected criminal activity or had specific orders to detain them. Tobin had apparently reached the same conclusion. "Agent Sutton, I'm Detective Tobin Merrick with the Houston Police Department. Unless you have specific authorization to detain law enforcement personnel, I'm going to need to see documentation of your operational authority." Bryce Sutton's expression hardened slightly. "Detective Merrick, this is a federal matter that supersedes local law enforcement jurisdiction. You need to comply with our instructions immediately." Cora Lansing stepped forward, her Homeland Security credentials visible in the beam of the tactical team's flashlights. "Agent Sutton, I'm Special Agent Cora Lansing with DHS Critical Infrastructure Protection Division. I have operational authority for investigations involving unauthorized construction in sensitive infrastructure corridors. Before we proceed further, I'm going to need to verify your chain of command and the authorization for this operation." The introduction of a third federal agency into the confrontation seemed to create uncertainty in Sutton's tactical team. Several of the operators exchanged glances, as if unsure how to proceed when faced with credentials from multiple agencies. Sutton himself appeared to be calculating whether to escalate the situation or attempt a different approach. "Agent Lansing, I'm not familiar with the Critical Infrastructure Protection Division," Sutton said. "I'm going to need to verify your credentials before proceeding." "By all means," Lansing replied, producing a phone from her vest. "My supervisory agent can be reached at this secure number. She'll confirm my operational status and authority." But before Lansing could make the call, one of the tactical operators behind Sutton raised his weapon and fired. The shot was suppressed, but still audible in the enclosed space of the tunnel, and Wesley saw Lansing stagger backward as the round struck her in the chest. She was wearing body armor that absorbed the impact, but the force of the shot knocked her to the ground. Wesley and Tobin reacted instantly, diving for cover behind the filing cabinets while returning fire at the tactical team. The chamber erupted into chaos as gunfire echoed through the concrete space, muzzle flashes creating strobing illumination that made it nearly impossible to track targets or assess the tactical situation. "Fall back to the southern tunnel," Wesley shouted to Tobin, grabbing Lansing and pulling her toward the corridor that led away from the tactical team's position. She was gasping for air but appeared to be uninjured beyond the blunt force trauma of taking a round to her body armor. They retreated into the southern tunnel with the tactical team in pursuit, moving through darkness broken only by the beams of flashlights and the occasional muzzle flash as shots were exchanged. The tunnel descended deeper underground, and Wesley could feel the temperature dropping as they moved away from the chamber and the elevator shaft that provided access to the surface. "Why did they shoot?" Tobin gasped as they ran. "If they were legitimate federal agents, they wouldn't open fire on other law enforcement." "Because they're not legitimate," Wesley replied. "They're whoever's been protecting the tunnel network, and they're here to make sure we don't leave with the information Delora found." Cora Lansing had recovered enough to run under her own power, though she was still breathing heavily from the impact. "We need to find an alternate route to the surface. That tactical team will have the elevator shaft secured, and they'll be bringing in reinforcements to search the entire tunnel network." The southern tunnel continued for several hundred feet before branching again, this time into a maze of smaller corridors that appeared to be part of the original Cold War facility network. Wesley made split-second decisions at each junction, choosing paths that led generally upward on the theory that any route heading toward the surface would eventually provide an exit. Behind them, they could hear the tactical team coordinating their search, using radio communications and systematic sweep patterns that suggested professional training. The pursuers weren't rushing or making mistakes. They were conducting a methodical hunt that would eventually corner their prey if Wesley couldn't find a way out of the tunnel system. After approximately 10 minutes of running through the labyrinth, they entered a chamber that was different from the others they had seen. This space had clearly been renovated within the past few years, with modern lighting systems, HVAC equipment, and what appeared to be living quarters. There were bunks arranged along one wall, a kitchenette with recent model appliances, and a work area with computer equipment that was currently powered down. "Someone's been living down here," Tobin observed, examining the living quarters more carefully. "This isn't abandoned Cold War infrastructure. This is an active facility." Wesley moved to the computer equipment, hoping to find information about the tunnel network or the people who were using it. But the systems were password protected and would require significant time to access, time they didn't have with the tactical team closing in on their position. It was Cora Lansing who found what they were looking for. In a corner of the chamber, partially concealed by a storage cabinet, was a spiral staircase leading upward. The staircase was modern construction, metal and concrete rather than the aged infrastructure of the original facility. "This is a recent addition," Lansing said. "Part of the expansion network that's been built over the past 20 years. It should lead to one of the buildings that's connected to the tunnel system." They began climbing the staircase, moving as quickly as they could while remaining quiet enough to avoid alerting the tactical team to their escape route. The staircase wound upward through multiple levels, passing doorways that led to corridors and chambers that appeared to serve various purposes. Some looked like storage facilities. Others resembled office spaces, and a few contained equipment that Wesley couldn't immediately identify. After climbing approximately 8 stories worth of stairs, they reached a doorway that opened into what appeared to be a basement level of an active building. The space beyond the door was well lit and climate-controlled, with the hum of machinery and the distant sounds of human activity suggesting they had reached an occupied structure. Wesley carefully opened the door and found themselves in a mechanical room filled with HVAC equipment and electrical panels. The room showed no signs of security cameras or alarm systems, suggesting that the tunnel connection was known only to a limited number of people rather than being openly documented. They moved through the mechanical room to a door marked Authorized Personnel Only and emerged into a basement corridor that showed all the signs of a commercial office building. Directional signs indicated they were in the basement level of One Houston Center, a major office tower in the heart of downtown. We're at least 6 blocks from the Merchants Exchange Tower, Tobin said, studying the building directory. Which means the tunnel network allowed us to travel that distance completely underground without any indication we were passing beneath city streets. Wesley was already planning their next move. We need to get out of this building and reach a secure location where we can analyze what we've discovered. The tactical team will realize we escaped through the tunnel system, and they'll be checking buildings that are connected to the network. As they moved toward the elevator that would take them to the ground floor, Cora Lansing grabbed Wesley's arm. "Agent Gage, before we leave, you need to understand what we're really dealing with. That tactical team wasn't improvising when they found us in the tunnels. They were expecting us, which means someone knew we'd be investigating Delora's disappearance and set up a response to intercept us." "You're saying we're being monitored," Wesley replied. "I'm saying that whoever's running the tunnel network has access to law enforcement communications and surveillance capabilities that allowed them to track our investigation in real time. They knew when you entered the Merchants Exchange Tower. They knew when I joined you in the underground chamber, and they dispatched a team to eliminate us before we could expose what we'd found." Tobin looked grim. "If they have that level of access to law enforcement systems, going back to our respective departments isn't going to be safe. They'll know where we are and what we're reporting." The realization that they had essentially become fugitives from the very institutions they worked for was both disturbing and necessary. Wesley understood that they were now in the same position that Delora Finch had been in when she discovered the tunnel network, possessing knowledge that powerful people wanted to suppress and facing threats from sources that should have been providing protection. As they rode the elevator to the ground floor of One Houston Center, Wesley found himself wondering whether Delora was still alive somewhere in the tunnel network, being held by the people who had been protecting its secrets, or whether she had already suffered the same fate as the previous investigators who had disappeared after asking too many questions about unauthorized underground construction. The elevator doors opened onto the building's main lobby, where late-night security guards sat at a desk monitoring closed-circuit cameras. The guards looked up as the 3 disheveled and obviously armed individuals emerged from the basement elevator, and Wesley saw the moment when they recognized that something unusual was happening. "Federal agents," Wesley said, displaying his credentials before the guards could reach for their radios. "We were conducting an inspection in the basement mechanical areas. Everything secure." The guards accepted the explanation with the kind of weary indifference that came from years of dealing with various authorities accessing the building at odd hours. They waved Wesley, Tobin, and Lansing through without further questions, and within moments the 3 investigators were on the street outside One Houston Center. Downtown Houston at 3 in the morning was largely deserted, with only occasional vehicles passing through the canyon of office towers and the homeless population that sheltered in doorways and bus stops. Wesley led them away from One Houston Center and toward a 24-hour diner several blocks away, a location where they could establish a temporary base and determine their next moves. But as they walked through the empty streets, Wesley couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. Not by the tactical team from the tunnels, but by something more pervasive and technologically sophisticated. The feeling intensified when he noticed that every security camera they passed seemed to track their movement, and that several vehicles that appeared to be randomly parked actually contained occupants who were observing their progress. "We're under surveillance," he said quietly to Tobin and Lansing. "Cameras and human watchers. Whoever's protecting the tunnel network has activated a surface-level monitoring operation." Cora Lansing had apparently noticed the same signs. "They're not trying to intercept us yet. They're tracking our movements and seeing where we go. possibly trying to identify anyone we make contact with. Then we can't go to any location where we'd normally seek help, Tobin observed. No police stations, no FBI field office, nowhere that's connected to our professional identities. Wesley made a decision that would commit them to operating completely outside official channels. I know a place where we can go to ground temporarily. Someone who owes me a favor and won't ask questions. But once we go there, we're cutting ourselves off from any institutional support or resources. As they changed direction and headed toward an address in Houston's Midtown district, Wesley pulled out his phone and composed a carefully worded text message to an attorney he had worked with on previous cases, someone who specialized in representing federal whistleblowers and witnesses who needed protection from powerful interests. The message was simple. Need secure communication channel. 3 witnesses with information about government corruption. Extremely time-sensitive. The response came within minutes. Coordinates attached. Come alone. Verify identity through established protocols. The coordinates led to a private investigation firm that the attorney sometimes used for cases involving sensitive witness protection. As they approached the location, Wesley saw that it was a nondescript office building in a commercial district, the kind of place that could easily be overlooked or forgotten. But before they could enter the building, Cora Lansing grabbed Wesley's arm and pointed toward a vehicle that had just turned the corner behind them. It was a black SUV with tinted windows, driving slowly and deliberately as if searching for something. That's a federal surveillance vehicle, Lansing said. Same type the tactical team would use for mobile operations. They had perhaps 30 seconds before the SUV would be close enough for its occupants to identify them. Wesley made a split-second decision and led them into an alley between buildings, moving quickly toward what he hoped would be an alternate entrance to the private investigation firm. As they ran through the alley, Wesley realized that they had crossed a threshold from which there might be no return. They were now actively evading what appeared to be federal law enforcement, operating without authorization or support, and possessing information about a conspiracy that had already demonstrated its willingness to use lethal force to protect its secrets. The question was whether the information they had gathered about the tunnel network would be enough to expose the conspiracy, or whether they would simply become the latest victims to disappear without a trace beneath the streets of Houston. The private investigation firm occupied the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better decades, its facade showing the weathered indifference of a structure that existed to be forgotten rather than noticed. Wesley, Tobin, and Cora Lansing entered through a service entrance that led to a freight elevator, ascending in silence broken only by the mechanical grinding of cables and pulleys that sounded like the building itself was groaning under the weight of secrets it had been forced to contain. The firm's office was a warren of cramped spaces filled with filing cabinets, surveillance equipment, and the accumulated detritus of investigations that had been conducted over years or decades. A woman in her 60s sat behind a desk that looked like it had survived multiple generations of private investigators, her sharp eyes evaluating the 3 disheveled and obviously distressed individuals who had just entered her domain. "Agent Gage," she said without preamble, "Marcus Kellogg said you'd be coming with sensitive information in hostile pursuit. I'm Vera Pritchard. I run this operation, and I don't ask questions that my clients don't want to answer. But I do need to know what kind of threat level we're dealing with so I can assess whether my security measures are adequate." Wesley had worked with Vera on 2 previous cases, involving federal witnesses who needed protection from agencies that were supposed to be safeguarding them. She had a reputation for absolute discretion and a network of resources that operated completely outside official channels, making her office one of the few places in Houston where fugitives from institutional power could find temporary sanctuary. "Miss Pritchard, we're being pursued by what appears to be a federal tactical unit that's willing to use lethal force," Wesley said. They're monitoring law enforcement communications and have access to surveillance systems throughout downtown Houston. We need a secure location where we can analyze evidence and establish contact with people who can help expose a conspiracy involving unauthorized infrastructure construction beneath the city. Vera's expression didn't change, but Wesley noticed her hand move slightly toward a control panel beneath her desk. That's a significant threat level. I'm activating my full security protocols, which will make this office invisible to electronic surveillance and provide early warning if anyone attempts a physical approach. You have 12 hours of secure time before I'll need to move you to an alternate location. She pressed several buttons on the control panel, and Wesley heard the distinctive sound of heavy locks engaging throughout the office. Metal shutters descended over the windows, blocking any line of sight from outside, and the ambient electromagnetic hum that was present in most modern buildings suddenly diminished as Vera activated what appeared to be a sophisticated signal-blocking system. This office is now a dead zone for electronic surveillance, Vera explained. No cell signals, no Wi-Fi, no transmissions in or out except through hardwired systems that I control. Anyone tracking you electronically just lost your signal. Tobin looked around the office with the expression of someone reassessing his understanding of what private investigation firms were capable of. Miss Pritchard, this level of security isn't standard for witness protection. What exactly is your background? Vera allowed herself a slight smile. Let's just say that before I started this firm, I spent 20 years helping government agencies protect assets who needed to disappear from threats both foreign and domestic. I brought some of that expertise with me when I retired from federal service. Cora Lansing had been examining the security measures with professional interest. Your former intelligence community, CIA or NSA, based on the sophistication of your countermeasures. Does it matter? Vera replied. What matters is that this office has never been successfully penetrated by hostile surveillance, and I've been protecting witnesses from threats much more sophisticated than a rogue FBI tactical unit. Now, Agent Gage, you said you have evidence that needs analysis. Let's see what you've discovered that's worth killing federal agents over. Wesley, Tobin, and Lansing spread out the documents and photographs they had gathered from the underground chamber, along with the maps that Cora had brought showing the extent of the tunnel network. As they organized the evidence, a pattern began to emerge that was even more disturbing than what Wesley had initially understood. The tunnel network beneath downtown Houston wasn't just a random collection of Cold War-era facilities and unauthorized expansions. It was a carefully designed system that connected specific buildings and infrastructure nodes in a way that suggested deliberate planning for purposes that went beyond simple transportation or storage. Look at this pattern, Lansing said, marking locations on the map. The tunnel network connects to federal buildings, including the FBI field office, the federal courthouse, and several facilities housing other government agencies. But it also connects to private sector buildings including major banks, corporate headquarters, and data centers. This isn't random construction. This is a network designed to provide covert access to critical infrastructure and high-value targets. Tobin was examining the building permits and construction records that Delora had compiled. These permits show a pattern of construction activity that corresponds with major events or political transitions. There's a spike in underground construction permits immediately after 9/11, another spike during the 2008 financial crisis, and ongoing activity during every election cycle for the past 20 years. It's like someone's been using periods of national distraction to accelerate their expansion of the tunnel network. Wesley felt the investigation shifting from a case about public corruption into something that resembled a counterintelligence operation. Agent Lansing, you said your division has been investigating this tunnel network. What's your assessment of who's behind it and what their purpose is? Cora Lansing was silent for a long moment before responding, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of conclusions she had been avoiding acknowledging. Agent Gage, I think we're looking at a compartmentalized government program that was initiated for legitimate security purposes but has been corrupted or co-opted by people with other agendas. The construction techniques, the funding mechanisms, the political protection, all of it suggests that this started as an authorized continuity of government project and then evolved into something else. What kind of something else? Tobin asked. A parallel infrastructure that could be used for surveillance, for covert movement of personnel and materials, for maintaining command and control capabilities that exist outside normal institutional oversight. Think about what you could accomplish if you had unrestricted access to tunnels that connect to major buildings throughout a city. You could conduct surveillance operations without ever being visible on the surface. You could move people or equipment without any record of their transportation. You could establish command centers that are completely invisible to anyone who doesn't know the tunnel network exists. Vera Pritchard had been listening to this exchange with the expression of someone hearing confirmation of suspicions she had harbored for years. What you're describing sounds like the infrastructure for a shadow government operation, the kind of thing that intelligence agencies build when they want the capability to operate without civilian oversight or democratic accountability. Wesley understood the implications, but he was still focused on the immediate question that had brought him into this investigation. None of this explains what happened to Delora Finch. She discovered the tunnel network and decided to investigate it on her own. Where is she now? Cora Lansing pulled out a photograph from her files, an image that appeared to have been captured by a surveillance camera in one of the tunnel sections. The photograph showed a woman who matched Delora's description, but her appearance was disturbing. She looked gaunt and disheveled, with the hollow-eyed expression of someone who had been subjected to prolonged stress or deprivation. This photograph was captured by a monitoring system that my division installed in one of the tunnel sections 3 weeks ago, Lansing said. It shows Delora Finch approximately 48 hours after she entered the Merchants Exchange Tower. She was alive at that point, but she was clearly in distress. Wesley felt a surge of hope mixed with dread. Where was this photograph taken? Can we determine her location from the background? Lansing examined the photograph more carefully, comparing it to the tunnel maps. Based on the construction details visible in the image, I believe this was taken in a section of the network that runs beneath the theater district, approximately 8 blocks west of the Merchants Exchange Tower. But Agent Gage, you need to understand that this photograph is 3 weeks old. We don't know if Delora is still in that location, or even if she's still alive. Tobin was studying the photograph with the analytical eye of someone who had spent years investigating missing persons cases. The way she's positioned in this image suggests she's moving with purpose rather than being held captive. She's not restrained, and her body language doesn't show the kind of defeated posture you'd expect from someone who's been imprisoned. It's possible she went deeper into the tunnel network voluntarily, trying to find evidence or answers. The possibility that Delora was still alive and actively investigating somewhere in the labyrinth beneath Houston gave Wesley a focus that cut through the overwhelming complexity of the conspiracy they had uncovered. We need to find her. Whatever information she discovered that made her disappear into the tunnels, she might still be trying to expose it. Vera Pritchard had been making notes while listening to their discussion. Agent Gage, if you're planning to go back into that tunnel system to search for your informant, you need to understand that you'll be operating in an environment where the people who control the network have every advantage. They know the layout, they control the surveillance systems, and they have the tactical capability to intercept and neutralize anyone they perceive as a threat. I'm aware of the risks, Wesley replied. But I made a commitment to protect Delora when she agreed to become an informant. If there's any chance she's still alive down there, I have to try to find her. Cora Lansing looked conflicted, as if weighing her institutional obligations against what her conscience was telling her to do. Agent Gage, if we go back into those tunnels, we're likely walking into a trap. The people operating the network know we escaped through this one Houston Center connection. They'll be expecting us to either flee the city or attempt a rescue operation. They'll have prepared for both scenarios. Then we do something they won't expect, Tobin suggested. We don't go in through the known access points that they'll be monitoring. We find an entrance they don't control and approach from a direction they won't anticipate. Vera Pritchard moved to a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder that contained maps and documents that looked decades old. When I was working for the agency, one of my assignments involved mapping emergency egress routes from government facilities in major American cities. Houston had an extensive network of connections between surface buildings and underground infrastructure, some of which were classified and never appeared in official city records. I kept copies of those maps when I retired, figuring they might be useful someday. She spread out a map that showed tunnel connections and access points that didn't appear on any of the documents Wesley or Lansing had compiled. The map revealed that the tunnel network was even more extensive than they had realized, with connections to buildings throughout downtown Houston and extending into adjacent neighborhoods. This access point, Vera said, indicating a location on the map, connects to the tunnel network through the basement of a parking garage that was built in the 1970s. The entrance was classified because it provided covert access to a federal building that housed sensitive operations. But the building was decommissioned in the 90s, and I doubt anyone currently operating the tunnel network knows this entrance exists. Wesley studied the location carefully. The parking garage was approximately 6 blocks from the theater district location where Delora had been photographed. If they could access the tunnel network through this forgotten entrance, they might be able to approach that area without alerting the people who were monitoring the more obvious access points. "How do we get into the parking garage?" Wesley asked. "If it was classified, it's probably secured." Vera smiled slightly. "I still have the access codes. They're probably 30 years old, but in my experience, classified facilities rarely bother updating security on entrances they think nobody knows about." Over the next 2 hours, they planned an operation that would have been impossible through official FBI channels. Using Vera's resources and knowledge, they acquired equipment including encrypted radios, body armor, and weapons that were completely untraceable to any government inventory. Vera also provided them with a vehicle that had been modified to be invisible to automated license plate readers and other surveillance systems. As dawn began to break over Houston, Wesley, Tobin, and Cora Lansing prepared to re-enter the tunnel network through the forgotten entrance that Vera had identified. The plan was straightforward but dangerous. Access the tunnels through the old parking garage, navigate to the theater district location where Delora had been photographed, search for any evidence of her current location, and extract before the tactical team could respond. The parking garage where the classified entrance was located sat in a deteriorating neighborhood that had been targeted for redevelopment for years, but remained frozen in a state of economic abandonment. The structure itself was a brutalist concrete monolith that looked like it had been designed to survive nuclear war, which, given its original purpose, was probably accurate. Vera's access codes still worked, opening a service entrance that led to a lower level of the garage that didn't appear on any public maps. The entrance to the tunnel system was concealed behind a maintenance store marked with warning labels about electrical hazards, labels that had probably been effective at deterring curious exploration for decades. Beyond the maintenance store was a stairwell that descended deep into the earth, its concrete walls showing the kind of aging that came from 50 years of slow deterioration. Wesley led the way down, his flashlight revealing a passage that eventually opened into the tunnel network they had explored hours earlier. But this section of the tunnels was different from what they had seen before. The construction was older, showing the distinctive characteristics of Cold War-era government work, but it had been maintained and in some cases upgraded with modern equipment. Lighting systems were still operational, and ventilation equipment hummed with the steady rhythm of machinery that was actively powered and monitored. "Someone's maintaining this section," Tobin observed. "These lights are LED, probably installed within the past few years, and that ventilation equipment is too modern to be original to the facility." They moved through the tunnels using the maps that Vera had provided, navigating toward the theater district location where Delora had been photographed. The route took them through a maze of corridors that intersected with the more modern tunnel sections, creating a disorienting environment where architectural styles from different eras blended together in ways that challenged spatial reasoning. After approximately 30 minutes of careful navigation, they reached a section of tunnel that matched the background visible in Delora's photograph. The area appeared to be some kind of junction point where multiple corridors intersected, creating a space that was larger and more open than the typical tunnel configuration. And it was there, sitting against a wall with a battery-powered lantern providing dim illumination, that they found Delora Finch. She was alive but appeared to be in the late stages of exhaustion and possibly dehydration. Her clothes were dirty and torn, and she had the hollow-eyed look of someone who had been surviving on minimal resources for an extended period. But when she saw Wesley, recognition flared in her eyes along with what might have been relief or possibly despair. "Agent Gage," Delora said, her voice rough and barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't have come looking for me. You should have stayed away from this place." Wesley approached her carefully, assessing her physical condition while scanning the surrounding tunnels for any indication of threat. "Delora, we're here to extract you. Can you walk?" "I can walk," she replied, "but it won't matter. They know you're here. They've known since you entered the parking garage. The tunnel network has monitoring systems throughout its entire length. Every section, every junction, every access point. You're being tracked right now." Cora Lansing was examining the junction area more carefully, and Wesley saw her expression shift to alarm as she identified something that confirmed Delora's warning. Mounted high on the tunnel wall, partially concealed by a support beam, was a small camera with an LED indicator that showed it was actively recording. "We're under surveillance," Lansing confirmed. "Delora's right. They know we're here." Tobin had his weapon drawn and was watching the tunnel entrances for any sign of the tactical team that had pursued them earlier. "Then we need to move now, before they can organize a response. Delora, can you tell us the fastest route back to the parking garage entrance?" But Delora shook her head slowly. "You don't understand. The routes you used to get here, they're already being sealed. The tunnel network has security measures that can isolate sections and trap anyone inside. They're not going to let you leave with me or with the information I've discovered." Wesley felt the tactical situation deteriorating, but he forced himself to focus on the immediate priority of protecting his informant. "Delora, what did you discover that made you hide down here for 3 weeks?" Delora gestured to a pile of documents and photographs she had apparently been compiling during her time in the tunnels. "I found the real purpose of this network, Agent Gage. It's not just infrastructure or emergency facilities. It's a surveillance and control system that monitors everything happening in downtown Houston. The buildings connected to the tunnels, they all have monitoring equipment installed. Cameras, listening devices, data taps on communication systems. Whoever controls this network has access to everything that happens in the financial district, the federal buildings, the corporate headquarters. They can see everything, hear everything, and access any computer system or communication network." The implications were staggering. If Delora was correct, the tunnel network wasn't just a hidden infrastructure project. It was the foundation for a surveillance apparatus that could monitor and potentially control activities throughout one of America's largest cities. "Who's operating this system?" Wesley asked. "Who has the resources and authority to build something like this?" Delora's expression showed the strain of someone who had been carrying knowledge too terrible to process. I found files in one of the facility nodes, records of planning meetings, budget allocations, personnel assignments. The network was initiated as a classified continuity of government project after 9/11, authorized at the highest levels of federal government. But over the past 20 years, it's been expanded and repurposed by people who saw its potential for purposes that go far beyond emergency preparedness. Before she could continue, the tunnel lights suddenly intensified, shifting from the dim ambient lighting to harsh illumination that eliminated all shadows and made it impossible to hide. Through the tunnel's communication systems, a voice echoed with the kind of amplified authority that was designed to be obeyed rather than questioned. Agent Gage, Detective Merrick, Agent Lansing, this is Special Agent Bryce Sutton. You are currently in a classified federal facility without authorization. You need to surrender immediately and submit to federal custody. Any resistance will be considered a threat to national security and will be met with appropriate force. Wesley positioned himself between Delora and the tunnel entrances, his weapon ready but knowing that they were in an impossible tactical situation. If the tunnel network could be sealed and isolated as Delora had warned, they were trapped with no possibility of fighting their way out against a superior force. "We know about the surveillance system," Wesley called out, gambling that revealing what they had discovered might create negotiating leverage. "We know about the monitoring equipment in the buildings, the data taps, the communication intercepts. Whatever this network was originally designed for, it's being used for mass surveillance that violates every constitutional protection Americans are supposed to have." There was a pause before Sutton responded, and when he spoke again, his tone had shifted from authoritative command to something that sounded almost like resignation. "Agent Gage, you're correct that the network's current utilization exceeds its original authorization, but you're wrong if you think exposing it will result in accountability or reform. The surveillance capabilities provided by this system are considered essential to national security by people at levels of government that you can't even imagine. The information gathered through the network has prevented terrorist attacks, exposed criminal conspiracies, and provided intelligence that has protected American interests globally. At the cost of constitutional rights," Cora Lansing called out. "You're describing warrantless surveillance on an industrial scale. Monitoring of American citizens without probable cause or judicial oversight. That's not national security, that's tyranny." Sutton's response carried a note of what might have been sympathy. "Agent Lansing, the world changed after 9/11. The threats we face require capabilities that couldn't exist within the constraints of traditional legal frameworks. The tunnel network and its surveillance systems represent a compromise between security and liberty, one that was made by people who understood the stakes involved." As Sutton spoke, Wesley noticed movement in the tunnels. Figures in tactical gear were taking up positions at the junction's entrances, creating a perimeter that would prevent escape while minimizing the risk of crossfire. The tactical team was preparing for a controlled apprehension rather than an immediate assault, which suggested they wanted Wesley and his companions alive. "Why haven't you just killed us?" Wesley asked. "You were willing to shoot at us earlier. What changed?" "Orders from above," Sutton replied. "Someone very senior wants to speak with you before any final decisions are made about how to handle this situation. You're being offered a choice, Agent Gage. Surrender peacefully, participate in a debriefing about what you've discovered, and you might walk away from this with your career and your life intact. Continue to resist, and you'll be designated as national security threats and handled accordingly." Tobin moved closer to Wesley, speaking quietly enough that the surveillance microphones might not pick up his words. "Gage, if we surrender to them, we disappear into whatever classified detention system they're operating. Nobody will know what happened to us, and the evidence we've gathered gets buried forever. Wesley knew Tobin was right, but he also understood that their tactical options were exhausted. They were trapped in a tunnel network controlled by hostile forces, surrounded by a tactical team that had every advantage, and facing a conspiracy that had demonstrated the willingness and capability to eliminate threats to its operations. It was Delora who provided the answer they needed. She had been quietly organizing the documents she had compiled during her weeks in the tunnels, and now she held up a small data storage device that looked like it might be a micro SD card. "Agent Gage, everything I discovered about the network is on this card," she said. "The surveillance systems, the monitoring capabilities, the buildings that are connected, the personnel involved. If this information reaches the right people, it could expose the entire operation." Before Wesley could respond, Delora did something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. She placed the data card in Wesley's hand, then turned and ran directly toward one of the tunnel entrances where the tactical team was positioned, shouting and drawing their attention and their weapons. The tactical team's response was instantaneous and lethal. Multiple shots rang out in the enclosed space of the tunnel junction, and Delora fell, her body crumpling in a way that left no doubt about the outcome. Wesley started to move toward her, but Tobin grabbed him and pulled him in the opposite direction, toward a tunnel section that was momentarily undefended as the tactical team focused on the distraction Delora had created. "Move now," Tobin shouted. "She gave us a chance. Don't waste it." They ran through the tunnels with the tactical team in pursuit, Delora's sacrifice providing the precious seconds they needed to reach a corridor that led away from the theater district junction. Behind them, Wesley could hear Sutton's voice through the communication system, ordering his team to seal the tunnel sections and prevent escape. But Cora Lansing had been studying the tunnel maps during their time at Vera Pritchard's office, and she led them through a series of turns and junctions that the tactical team apparently hadn't anticipated. They emerged into a section of the network that looked different from anywhere they had been before. Older and more deteriorated, with construction characteristics that suggested it predated the Cold War facilities. "These are storm drainage tunnels from the 1920s, Lansing explained as they ran. The modern network was built alongside the old city infrastructure, but some of these original tunnels were never properly mapped or sealed. If we can find a connection to the surface drainage system, we might be able to escape." They ran for what felt like hours, but was probably less than 30 minutes, moving through darkness and decay until they finally emerged into a drainage channel that led to Buffalo Bayou, the waterway that ran through central Houston. They climbed out of the tunnel system onto the bayou's concrete banks, filthy and exhausted but alive. As they caught their breath in the pre-dawn light, Wesley looked at the data card that Delora had given him, a small piece of technology that contained information that might expose a surveillance conspiracy operating beneath one of America's largest cities. But he also thought about the cost of obtaining that information. Delora's life sacrificed to provide evidence that might never result in accountability or reform. 3 months later, Wesley sat in a conference room at the Justice Department in Washington, D.C., watching as attorneys and investigators reviewed the contents of Delora's data card. The information she had compiled was comprehensive and damning, documenting a surveillance network that monitored communications, tracked movements, and collected data on millions of Americans without warrants or judicial oversight. But as the investigation progressed, Wesley learned what Bryce Sutton had tried to tell him in the tunnels. The surveillance network operated under classified authorizations that had been approved at the highest levels of government. The legal framework that enabled its operations had been constructed through secret interpretations of national security law that were never subjected to public debate or democratic oversight. The investigation was eventually classified, sealed behind layers of secrecy that ensured the American people would never learn about the surveillance infrastructure that existed beneath their own cities. Wesley was offered a promotion and a transfer to a field office far from Houston, a reward for his discretion in not pursuing the matter through public channels. He declined the promotion and resigned from the FBI. Tobin Merrick returned to the Houston Police Department's cold case unit, but found that his questions about the tunnel network investigation were consistently rebuffed or redirected. After 6 months of running into bureaucratic walls, he took early retirement and moved to Colorado. Cora Lansing disappeared from public record entirely. Her employment with the Department of Homeland Security was expunged from official databases, and attempts to contact her through any former colleagues resulted in responses indicating that no one by that name had ever worked for the agency. And the tunnel network beneath Houston continued to operate, expanded, and refined by people whose names Wesley would never learn, and whose purposes remained hidden behind classifications that treated American citizens as subjects to be monitored rather than citizens to be served. 2 years after Delora's death, Wesley received an unmarked envelope delivered to the small private investigation firm he had opened in Seattle. Inside was a single photograph showing a new section of tunnel beneath Houston's downtown area, along with a handwritten note that contained only 3 words: "It never stops." Wesley studied the photograph for a long time before placing it in a secure file with the other evidence from the case, evidence that he maintained in the probably futile hope that someday, somehow, the truth about the downtown labyrinth would be exposed to the light. But deep down, he suspected that Delora Finch had been right about what she'd told him in those final moments before her death. Some systems of power and control were too deeply embedded, too thoroughly protected, and too essential to certain interests to ever be truly dismantled or exposed. The tunnel network would continue to grow beneath Houston and probably beneath other American cities, invisible infrastructure serving purposes that would never be publicly acknowledged or democratically authorized. And the only people who would know the truth about what existed in that labyrinth of concrete and darkness were those who had ventured into it and survived to carry the burden of knowledge they could never fully share. Wesley locked the file containing the photograph and returned to his regular casework, helping clients with investigations that had clear resolutions and defined outcomes. But sometimes late at night, he would think about Delora running toward the tactical team's weapons, sacrificing herself to provide a chance for the truth to escape from the tunnels. And he would wonder whether her sacrifice had meant anything at all, or whether the labyrinth beneath the city had simply swallowed another truth that was too dangerous to acknowledge in the bright world above.